There were levels to the Institute's energy tanks. 3 grades were openly available to students. A 4th existed, but it was kept private, reserved for the Grand Professor alone. Black grade was the beginner tank, meant for spryers. Newbies who strengthened themselves through blood circulation training used it to stabilize and build their foundations. Cost: 50 gyno points per use. Brown grade was for phasers, those who had moved past the beginner stage. A phaser had opened their genetic pool and fully merged with a gene, allowing them to phase their abilities in and out naturally. Cost: 5,000 gyno points per use. Red grade belonged to Phantom Beastmasters. That was a full level above phasers. They had refined multiple fused genes into a single, terrifying entity. At peak battle state, they could summon a Beast Phantom, a long-range manifestation that turned the battlefield into their hunting ground. Cost: 500,000 gyno points per use. Most instructors in the Institute were stuck at the peak of this level. Only a few managed to break through to the next stage, and the reason was simple. Energy tanks weren't optional. You needed them to strengthen your body, to recover from injuries, and to survive the kind of combat that actually pushed your level upward. Training alone helped, sure, but the fastest, cleanest path to growth was combat. Not friendly sparring, not duels between humans. Real fights. Fights against stronger REBs. Even if you lost but escaped alive, your combat ability rose. If you won and killed the REB, your growth could explode. And if you soaked in an energy tank afterward, the improvement could double. David didn't know any of this. No one had properly explained the process either. So when it was his turn, he ignored the blonde senior stationed nearby and walked straight toward the tank. In front of him stood a massive structure. A transparent glass container nearly 5 meters tall, filled to the brim with thick blue liquid that glowed faintly under the lights. David barely had time to admire it before he started moving. Up the stairs, step by step, to the rim. At the top, he stared down into the heavy blue fluid, steadied his breathing, and prepared to jump in. Then his body reacted. That same strange, warning feeling surged up again, prickling across his skin like invisible needles. David froze. He muttered under his breath, backed away from the edge, and climbed down. So, jumping in is wrong. And that's exactly why the senior is here. David's brows pulled tight. Damn it, I messed up. He turned, forcing his face into something friendly. Greetings, senior, he said, flashing the biggest smile he could manage. Forgive my negligence. I was in a bad mood earlier. I apologize for the inconvenience. The smile was fake. The tone was polite but flat. He wasn't good at pretending respect. The blonde senior watched him with a wide grin, like he'd been waiting for this. Oh, the man said, ignoring the apology completely. And what does Junior want from me? David's patience thinned. He dropped the act. I assume you were assigned here to assist new students with the energy tank, he said, expressionless. He tried to be civil. The other guy clearly wasn't interested. The blonde man laughed, leaning back with his arms folded. Haha, you're right. So what? David smiled again, but this time it was cold. So, you're saying you won't assist me? That was the trap. If the senior refused outright, it would be on record. His job was literally to guide the newbies. The blonde man's smile faded into a glare. You've got a sharp mouth. Thanks, David replied. I try. They stared at each other for a moment. Then, abruptly, the senior sighed as if he'd gotten bored. Fine, you win. He walked toward a long metallic box nearby and tapped it with his fingers. That's a cryogenic pod, he said. It puts you into deep sleep, then transports you into the tank. Just press the button to open the lid. His sudden change of attitude felt off. Too smooth. Too quick. David didn't relax. If anything, the shift made him more uneasy. The blonde man waved a hand casually. Don't worry. I can't open it without your permission. I don't have that authority. David could tell he probably wasn't lying. Still, his stomach didn't like it. But he was exhausted, sore, and sick of standing. The warning bells in his head rang, and he ignored them. He pressed the button. Air hissed. Mechanisms clicked. With a heavy whoosh, the lid opened, revealing a hollow interior shaped perfectly for a human body. David climbed in and lay down. The lid closed with a dull thud. Inside, He could hear his own breathing, his heartbeat, the faint hum of the machine. In less than a second, chemicals flooded the pod's atmosphere. Cold seeped through the air, then through his skin, deep into his bones. His teeth almost chattered. So that's why it's called cryogenic, he thought. Then his consciousness slipped away. Outside, the blonde senior turned and walked back toward his desk, snorting under his breath. You think you can act tough and walk away clean? His eyes narrowed, satisfied. Going into the energy tank twice when it hasn't even been a week. Ignorant brat. He smiled, the kind of smile that meant he expected something bad to happen. Because this wasn't David's first soak this week. It was his second in 2 days. And whatever came next, nobody could say for sure how his body would react. Inside the Institute, everyone knew one rule. Abuse the energy tank, and you increase the chance of losing control. Losing control didn't just mean getting reckless. It meant your mind could fracture. Or worse, something inside you could start steering your thoughts and instincts like reins. Because the transplanted object wasn't truly an object at all. It came from an REB. And no matter how cleanly the genetic association modified it, there was always a risk that traces of the monster remained. Not obvious at first, not strong enough to matter. But as the host grew stronger, those hidden genetic traits could awaken too, feeding off the same growth. Quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the simplest explanation, the REB's leftover genetic imprint could start trying to invade the brain's microcells, twisting the helix structure, attempting to seize the control center from the inside. In the superstition, the soldiers whispered. It was like a beast's soul hiding in the organ. Weak at first, then growing with you until it finally tried to devour you whole. The dumb ones erupted early, driving the host mad and wrecking the body. The smart ones waited. They pretended to sleep until the day you slipped. That was why serums existed. Not just to strengthen, but to suppress. To keep the monster sidechained. David didn't know any of this yet. And John wasn't about to tell him. Not after their little clash. About an hour later, the energy room was busy. Multiple tanks were occupied, their glass slightly fogged and bluish, showing only the vague silhouettes of sleeping bodies submerged deep inside. In one particular tank, the blue fluid had faded until it was almost clear. A few bubbles rose now and then, disturbing the surface like quiet breaths. Then, splash, a figure burst up through the surface. David. He coughed hard, spitting out liquid that had slipped into his lungs. Cough, cough. He grabbed the rim of the tank and hauled himself up, breathing in long, greedy gulps of air. Relief lit his eyes. The soreness in his body had eased dramatically. The exhaustion that had sat deep in his bones felt like it had been scraped out and thrown away. He clenched his fist. Vitality surged through him. Not just strength, but fullness, like every cell had been refilled and rewired. His blood moved warm and fast through his veins, pulsing with a rhythm that felt cleaner than before. He was stronger, not by as much as the first time, but enough to feel it. David jumped down from the 5-meter tank and landed lightly, almost surprised by how controlled his body felt. He exhaled a breath of stale air and turned toward the exit, ready to leave. That's when he saw John. John stood by his desk, smiling like a polite receptionist. "I hope you enjoyed the energy tank," he called out warmly. "Please come again very soon." The word sounded nice. The smile didn't. Inside his head, John was already laughing. "Go ahead, come a third time. I'd love that. Let's see how long you stay lucky." He knew every new student was issued 100 gyno points at the start. David had soaked twice. So John assumed he was broke now. And that made the whole thing even funnier. A short-lived brat with a temporary glow. Sooner or later, the consequences of tank abuse would show up. John couldn't wait to see David's face when it happened. He smacked his lips lightly, already savoring it. And in his mind, David wasn't worth real effort. If the kid's potential burned out early, he'd just end up thrown into the army within a year anyway. No threat. Not important. At the entrance of the energy building, David suddenly felt a chill crawl up his spine. He stopped and looked back, as if his eyes could pierce steel walls and lock onto John. "I knew it," David thought, jaw tightening. "That bastard's planning something." I need to be careful. He glanced down at his training suit. It was torn and stained with dark, dry blood. Yeah, he needed to clean up. He broke into a quick jog toward his dorm. Not long after, the Institute's massive auditorium was packed. Hundreds of students sat in rows, murmuring excitedly while checking their projection screens. Faces were flushed. Voices were sharp with gossip. A small crowd surrounded a Spanish boy who was replaying a live projection, temporarily overriding the privacy imprint that normally blurred other people's displays in a harmless light. News had spread fast. A group of new students had been attacked about an hour ago. Nobody died, but several were badly injured. Fight footage was already circulating like wildfire. One clip drew the most attention. Sturm, the bulky brute who'd almost stomped David earlier, was fighting a thin, handsome youth with blue hair who looked Chinese. The contrast was ridiculous. One was a mountain, the other a blade. Everyone expected Sturm to win on pure power. But what happened next made the whole hall go quiet. Sturm went down in 10 hits. 10. Not 10 minutes. Not 10 exchanges. 10 punches. Students replayed it again and again, unable to accept what they were seeing. They watched the blue-haired boy walk out of frame like it was nothing, like dropping a giant was a casual warm-up. And right at that moment, David walked into the hall. Schwa! Dozens of eyes snapped onto him at once. David slowed, confused by the sudden pressure. For a second, it felt like the entire room had been waiting for him.
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
The students watching could only gasp in amazement as they watched the blue-haired figure walk out of the video's range. It was at this moment that David walked into the hall. Schwa! Numerous eyes swiftly fell on him. He was instantly confused and a bit pressured. Frowning slightly, he ignored the gazes while he walked towards a particularly empty seat. Settling down, he saw that most people were projecting visible holographic images into the air. Not willing to lose out, he stood to ask his students, "The hell is going on?" Looking away from his holographic projection, Grover cast a sidelong glance at David. "Stop bothering me, go," as his speech stopped as he visibly froze. His lips quivered a bit as he turned around again, as if to confirm something. "Ayo-wee." He stuttered for a few seconds. It seemed as if he had recognized David from somewhere. David didn't say anything. He just watched on with a deadpan expression. Finally getting himself together, Grover replied, "There were quite a few impressive battles amongst the elites of our set, roughly an hour ago." Excitement visible in his eyes, he sputtered on. And the cause of this was none other than the rankings list that was unexpectedly released a few hours ago by the Institute. His eyes shined as spittle flew all over. "I heard that the rankings list was supposed to be released after a week, but the Institute unexpectedly released it before the official release date. It was like chaos on Earth. Those terrifying monsters that were previously wolves in sheep's clothing wishing to gain an extra advantage immediately pull off their cloaks and battled those at the top 10. David blinked his eyes. It seemed like he wasn't the only one who had been attacked by others. Not noticing David's pondering expression, Grover's tone turned soft as he whispered. Word got out that the first position obtained 10,000 gyno points. David's eyes widened a bit as he asked, "Really?" Although he had made some speculations about it, as he had calculated the numbers of gyno points the others in the rankings list would be allocated based on the amount given to him. He didn't want to arouse any suspicion, bringing trouble to himself. If he had acted like he knew, one might suspect he was among the lucky bastards enlisted on the rankings list, which would turn out to be an extremely troublesome matter to deal with. Although some might have known of his identity. It was very expensive, though. Not many of the students are that rich. Even if they are, they would likely keep it to themselves. It was 300 gyno points, not 30. Grover tapped his arm, projecting an image to the air. David only saw a few rays of dim light. In just a few seconds, the image distorted. Soon afterwards, he could see a video of two figures standing a few meters apart. He instantly recognized the huge one to be Sturm, the bulky figure that almost attacked him earlier, but couldn't recognize the other figure. Unexpected, Sturm was knocked back in the video in a contest of strength and beaten to unconsciousness at the 10 punch. David's face tightened. He had seen through the basics of Sturm's strength. DAV knew he was no match for him. Fighting him was basically courting death. Even if he had used the same tactics as he did with the red hair, it was highly likely he would lose. But now there was someone who could beat him into a pulp in 10 blows. Just how do these people practice? Grover moved closer. I heard that the blue-haired guy is called Lufone. I also heard that with his combat prowess, he was only capable of retaining the third position. He whispered. David's heart clenched uncontrollably. Although he had not thought himself very strong, he had also never thought of himself this weak. Thinking back to when he assumed he could sweep through his peers, it was a truly laughable thought. Third place? With that strength? What about first and second? What kind of monsters are those? As if hearing his thoughts, Grover continued, they say the first and second place in the rankings lists are very strong, but no one actually knows who they are. Calming his nerves, David pondered. Although there exists a possibility it was true fact, it could all just be rumors. Knocking himself up just for something like this wasn't his style. Thanks. He turned back to his seat after saying that, leaving the slightly chubby Grover, wide-mouthed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In a few moments, a very large, middle-aged, ugly man entered the hall. The class immediately descended to silence. The previous chattering sound died down. Good morning, students. I am your instructor for this class. I do hope we get along quite well. With a flirtatious smile, he winked at the female students. The students instantly felt a chill running down their spine. The guys glared at the instructor almost simultaneously. David's lips couldn't help but twitch. What was this situation? I will make sure to attend to you guys quite thoroughly. But for now, let's get down to business. I will take you things concerning theories. As if he didn't notice their glares, he continued. Exercise methods and combat techniques are two separate things entirely. This captured David's attention as he thought she was speaking specifically to him. Exercise methods or manuals exponentially increases one's rate of heartbeat, thereby increasing and improving one's overall body capabilities such as strength, flexibility, speed, etc. permanently. The instructor's voice has gradually grown solemn. When practiced to the highest level, special effects may be obtained. Listen carefully, I said maybe, his voice stern. Now, let's visit the matter concerning combat techniques. Combat techniques are fighting methods that increases one's strength, reaction time, speed, or other aspects explosively for a short period of time, reducing one's stamina in exchange, just in case you don't mix them up in the future. For example, the impulse fist. Go to your combat instructor for further information. I'm only here to sort out the theoretical problems in cultivation. The instructor pointed out. David felt his mind buzz as if trying to tell him something, but unfortunately he didn't quite grasp it. Smiling softly, he continued. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the levels involved. Both exercising methods and combat techniques are divided into different grades, and which is then divided into 3 different levels. Black grade, brown grade, and lastly red grade. That's as far as the best of you could get anyways. They are all divided into 3 levels in which the power level, gyno points, and difficulty increases respectively. Low level, mid-level, and high level. For example, the impulse fist is a low-level black grade technique. Easy to learn, costs 499 gyno points, and increases one's strength by a bit. The rebounding body is a mid-level black grade technique. A bit hard to learn, cost 899 gyno points because it's a body technique, increases the bodily defense by more. The drill punch is a high-level black grade technique. 999 gyno points. He watched the student's odd expression, causing him to smile. To my main reason for coming here, like I said previously, is to deal with problems regarding theories on the practice methods and combat techniques. To start with, every instructor or professor in the Institute says that there are practically no easy shortcuts to help improve one's strength, because most ways are very dangerous, which includes constant dangerous battles with REBs or things like that. But I will tell you, there's a shortcut to everything in life. It just depends if you're willing to put in the effort, take it or not. The fat instructor smiled handsomely, as if he just said something casual. David didn't seem to hear the last part of the instructor's speech, as his brain seemed to be electrocuted. At some point in time, his expression had long since crumbled. He had finally figured out what was amiss. During the time he went to select an exercise manual, he was unaware of the categories. Although he had read through the student's manual, he only skimmed through it. He had been ignorant and had chosen a combat technique instead of an exercise manual. A red grade one at that. He didn't know whether he should break out into tears or laughter. All of a sudden, the words Janine had said during their battle regarding a red grade technique made quite a lot of sense. Slapping his forehead in his foolishness from the beginning, even with the name of the technique, threefold step, one would know that it was a fighting technique. There was nothing else he could do unless he went ahead to select an appropriate exercise manual, but by the time he started practicing it, most average student strength would probably surpass his during that time. This caused a massive headache to David. To my main reason for coming here, like I said previously, is to deal with problems regarding theories on the practice methods and combat techniques. To start with, every instructor or professor in the Institute says that there are practically no easy shortcuts to help improve one's strength because most ways are very dangerous, which includes constant dangerous battles with REBs or things like that. But I will tell you, there's a shortcut to everything in life. It just depends if you're willing to put in the effort, take it or not. The ears of every student perked up as they wished to listen to the shortcut they could to improve themselves. This captivated Dav's attention swiftly. For now, I will only mention those concerning combat techniques. Exercising manuals comes later. Every combat techniques, the black grade, brown grade, even the red grade, utilizes the vibration and oscillatory principle. The instructor was visibly shaking in excitement. The discovery was made by a genius in combat theories a few decades ago by Nuclei and Bristol. He made a bold assumption, saying even in the ancient times, when the martial saints still ruled over Earth, the mass destruction techniques they all had performed was proven to contain destructive and mysterious oscillating and vibrating frequencies that could casually slice mountain peaks and even smash them apart. From the bits and pieces of information we have managed to excavate from the ancient runic battlegrounds, we have strived to come up with a few strong battle techniques of our own, rather than stealing the genes of the REBs to make them ours. Becoming a Sprier grants one the ability to control any exterior parts of the body more easily, and as time passes or as one grows stronger, controlling the interior parts of the body becomes a possibility. To begin learning a combat technique, the control of the muscles are the most important. It requires vibrating the muscles to a specific frequency and a few external actions such as body movement. He let out an audible sigh. Within the Institute, there was obviously this with terrifying controls over their bodies, but they would never be able to control their overall muscles perfectly. But David was an exception. It was unknown when it started, but he had noticed with rapt attention that he could control most part of his body, if not all. It was a terrifying thought, but he had Bieber once thought much about it and hadn't really tested its limits either. When instructor Ella had mentioned something similar to that, he had been mistaken into thinking it was the normal ability gained from becoming a Sprier, except he was wrong. David felt that if he really tried his best, he could make his blood move throughout his body. It was inconceivable thought, as anyone who headed him would probably laugh his ass off. Even David felt that he was probably mistaken and hadn't tried to experiment it with himself. It was probably because he had been busy. He hadn't had enough time to ponder on it thoroughly. He had even almost forgotten about it. But the instructor's words drove him wide awake. But right now, he desperately wanted to test it here, with the instructor in place just in case something went wrong. The instructor then proceeded with a heavy sigh. It's a pity that we haven't managed to find any test subject with extreme control over its muscles and body. We might just be able to extract the secrets from it. This words immediately drew Dav's actions to a standstill. Test subject? Extract? He could help but shiver at the thought. It was unknown what would happen if he was discovered. Although he hadn't experimented on it, he knew his body wouldn't deceive him. He calmed himself down. He planned on testing it after the class. It wasn't that there weren't any beast or humans with extreme muscle controls. It's just that they had trained themselves to a very high level, making them powerhouses each on their own. To experiment on them just for the sake of increasing the muscle's control was just too wasteful. Even the Grand Professor would oppose to such wasteful uses of precious material. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Scrolling down through the list of top 10 individuals in the rankings. When it got to the 7th place, David Syntax, the pretty fingers visibly froze. Phillida's eyebrow rose as she pondered. Suddenly, she tapped in the option, selecting for more information in exchange for 300 points. She was previously interested in him, but now that she had been ordered to keep a watch on him, it had evolved from simple interest into an extreme curiosity. In spite of the fact that 300 gyno points was no small amount, she had paid 300 points with no hesitation. It was impossible for her family's elder to transfer some to her, as that was going against the rules of the Institute. The most he could was to grant her some preferential different. Otherwise, he would definitely lose his job in the Institute, since there were many people vying for the positions in the Institute. 7th, David Syntax. Room No. 13248. Combat Techniques. Threefold Step. Red Level Technique. Current location. Archive. First floor. Battle status. Currently protected. Her beautiful lips pursed as she went deep into contemplation. Exchanging for one's information won't include the exercising method of the individual, which was quite the dilemma for Phillida. However, she believed that the Institute definitely had a detailed information on David. She just had to find means to get it. But she soon frowned. Red level technique. What was this guy trying to pull? Should I call him ignorant or too smart? Her thoughts soon changed. Just because she was asked to keep an eye on him and also retrieve some information on him doesn't mean he was very intelligent. He could a worthless individual, and the only thing keeping him valuable is the information he held. Coming to this conclusion, David's threat level dropped by half, and the reason why it don't fully drop to the lowest level is because she could never underestimate someone who is in the 7th place on the rankings list, protected at that. Protected means currently unavailable for any force battles. It was a bit past 6 p.m. in the evening. The sun was about to set as the evening revealed itself. The archive. Lots of students were currently in the archive, either to read the past experiences of their predecessors' experience in exercise manuals and had taken the paths they had chosen, or were reading each manuals cautiously and carefully in a bid to select a suitable path for themselves. David once again entered the archive. He typed in the virtual space code and then got ready to actually select his own exercise manual. But he saw something with the corner of his eyes which instantly grabbed his attention. It was the young lady who had misled him the first time he came here. She was still in the same position as before, seated behind the counter and reading. That's right, he didn't think it was his fault at all for choosing a combat technique instead of an exercise method. He had already set his mind to it, that it was the fault of the girl behind the counter. But with his magnanimity, he decided to just let it be. His view distorted as numerous manuals and books filled his vision. There was at least 5 different stairs going to the next floor. David chose randomly, as he still had something else to do when he got to his room. Standing in front of the bookcases, he still felt a bit overwhelmed and a little intimidated. It was unknown when, but he felt that he had matured a bit. At least, he didn't have the sudden urge to burn down the library this time compared to the last. Compared to the last time he picked up a random book and left, he observed his surroundings in detail. The books on the first floor contains black grade exercise manuals, which is obvious by the black colored outer book covers. The first floor is then divided into 3 different sections, containing low-level, mid-level, and high-level technique respectively. The second floor comprises of black grade combat manuals, which is also divided into 3 areas: low-level, mid-level, and high-level techniques. The third floor and the 4th level comprises of brown grade books, while the 5th and 6th floor contains red grade techniques. David had unknowingly gone there the other time. Striding with large steps, he went straight towards the exercise manuals. Electri Boost, an exercising manual that requires the use of electricity, jolting the hearts to help revolve the blood and system at a faster rate. When practiced to the highest level, minuscule amount of electrical voltage could be produced when the blood is being circulated to the highest level. Traits: more suitable for those who couldn't stand in at a single place for long periods of time. Revolving dragon, extracted from the mysteries contained in the breathing technique called true revolving dragons. When practiced to the highest level, one's every breath would propel the blood at a domineering speed, akin to a revolving dragon. Traits: more suitable for those with domineering actions. Energy cache, stores more energy in the body than an average spryer could. When practiced to the highest level, the body could contain at least 25% more energy than an average spryer. Triads, more suitable for those with the ability to hold in their anger. The unrestrained, just as the name implies, it expands the blood vessels, allowing energy to pass through unrestricted. When practiced to the highest level, every punch could release 25% more energy than an average individual. Traits: as the name implies, it's more suitable for those that are unrestrained. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Time passed in the blink of an eye. It was roughly a bit more than 1 hour when DAV made his decision. He picked up a particularly manual, then went ahead to select another combat technique. A black grade, mid-level one this time. He left the archive for his dorm. When he was just a street away from his dorm, the sun had gone down and the shy stars were finally getting bolder by the minute. The streets that were particularly bustling faded away like smoke as Davy turned into an empty alley, a shorter passage towards his dorm. All of a sudden, 2 figures emerged from a corner of the street. Dav instantly squinted his eyes to see them, both simultaneously male and female. He immediately recognized the female figure, but the male, he seemed to have seen him somewhere, but couldn't remember clearly where it was. He swiftly felt an ominous feeling from the incoming figure. His mind tensed as his gaze drooped, his body reacted. He stood still casually, almost as if he was relaxing while standing. His muscles tightened as his body relaxed. His heart constricted for a longer period of time, before suddenly releasing itself in a very powerful force, propelling blood at a massive velocity towards his body, giving him a slow but stronger, steady flow of energy. He was like the calm before the raging storm. He could clearly feel a very threatening vibe from the male figure, thus his body reaction. His instincts were practically screaming danger, and for him to quickly retreat, but as he had gained more control over his bodily instincts, he forcefully suppressed it as he knew there was little actions the 2 figures could possibly make under the ever-watching gazes of the Institute. Not giving enough time to think, the blue-haired male figure and the red-haired female stopped 15 meters away from him. The distance was clear enough for David to see them much clearly. It was Janine, the one who had fought against David in the morning, but she came with someone else. The blue-haired figure was clearly an Asian teenager. He has an extremely thin lips, slim and long nose, finely curved eyebrows that very much looked carved. What was exceptionally outstanding was his piercing blue eyes that glistened like stars in the skies. Any lady would be specially smitten by them. David suddenly had a look of realization on his face. He recalled where he had seen the blue-haired figure. It was on the figure who had beaten Sturm unconscious in just 10 blows on the projection he had seen earlier in the day. Janine's eyes went red for a bit. She held onto the blue figure's arm as she sniffed. "Big bro." "That's him," she said as she pointed towards David. As soon as those words landed out, those blue eyes moved. They landed on David's. David's body relaxed, more as he looked gazes with those piercing blue eyes with a relaxed body language. But his instincts screamed danger in that second. The blue-haired figure pointed towards David. "You send me a force duel, take a punch from me, and I will let this slide," Lu Feng said in a soft but strangely domineering voice. His expression indifferent. But he... "Be quiet." Lu Feng cut her off with a sidelong glance. "I know you." That was the only thing he said before ignoring her totally. Janine could only pout, feeling aggrieved at his second words. David felt immense pressure as if he had been locked into by a beast. He felt that as long as he said the word no, the beast would lose its patience and attack quite abruptly. Lowering his head, his long fringe covered his eyes slightly, preventing them from being seen. DAV seemed to be thinking of something, and only after staying silent for a while did he say, "And what if I say no?" DAV seemed to smirk. Lu Feng's gaze sharpened, and the air seemed to get colder by several degrees. Janine's teary face seemed to smile by this development. Action and reaction are both interwoven. "I advise you. The consequences would be severe," Lu Feng said towards David with an indifferent gaze. "What nonsense is this guy spouting?" DAV muttered under his breath. "What a joke. You came here, blocking my way in the middle of the street, spouting nonsense about whatnot. Who the hell do you think you are?" DAV said in a sleepy tone. He even had a slight smile on his face, but the words he had spoken were surprisingly forceful as his droopy eyes locked gazes with the blue ones. DAV didn't hold back with his tone, as he knew that aside from a few small pranks, there were not much harm Lu Feng could perform. And who knows what would happen if he really sent a force duel to him. He obviously wouldn't stop at just one punch. He might just cripple him. In the Institute, they greatly place emphasis on their rules and laws, and as there were many surveillance instruments placed at every corner of the massive island, there was never a chance for anyone to break the rules. Although the Institute allows injuring and even killing of fellow students, that was under the premises that one of them had force duel the other. But if that wasn't the case, the Institute would immediately rusticate both students involved in the fight as long as both of them are injured regardless of whose fault it was. But if it were a one-size battle, there were a few changes that would be made to the punishment that would match a better verdict. DAV knew this, and that was what gave him the extra courage to not compromise. Well, he might also not be clearly aware of his words, as the former David would at least compromise. Extreme excitement shone on Janine's face as she observed the deteriorating situation, and without missing a beat, she pointed. "Big bro, can you see how arrogant he is? I only requested for him to lend me his position for a while, but he said I had to battle him for it. As I had no choice in the matter, I had to send him a forced battle mail, but I didn't expect him to be so shameless as to sneak attack a lady." "That's enough." Cutting her off once again, Lu Feng gave her a glare this time. "Just because you're in a protected state, you believe I can't do nothing to you?" As he said those words, he lifted his hands. Within his fingers, there was a fine blue cube the size of a few inches. It was a bit transparent, as one could occasionally see a few streaks of electricity flowing through them. Even with the slight bright street illuminators, the streak of blue electricity flashing was still visible. The instant DAV saw the cube, his heart thumped loudly in his chest. Technology is every man's romance. With the little time he had gone through some of the few basic and low-level techs available in the Institute. He finally got the reason his bodily instincts was screaming danger despite his favorable situation. It was because Lu Feng had one of the gadgets in the Silencer series with him. A lowest level in the Silencer series, particularly the F1, B4U cubic EMP, is a type of gadget which is grouped into the Silencer series of contraptions. The contraption wasn't at all harmful, but the only uses was that it could silently silence any operating device available within the 100-meter radius for 30 seconds, cutting off its ability to send and receive data via myriads of waves or rays. It is a specifically low-grade silencing contraption, judging from its first few characters, F1. In the Institute, there are a few special gadgets things that could counter or tamper with the equipment of the Institute. These gadgets are not necessarily sold within the Institute nor by the Institute, but they were still also being sold in the Institute. In every Institute, there exists various underground factions, or like the average person would like to call it, cults. These cultists are a very secretive group of people that were formed within the Institute. As the security and surveillance within the Institute were rather tight, the members weren't even allowed to interact with themselves. They could only recognize themselves through a few secret gestures, actions, by the style of clothes they put on, or by their hairstyle, and even by the type of music they listened to. The Institute were rather aware of them. There were countless measures the higher echelon of the Institute could take to get rid of such organization, but the Institute chose to tolerate them. The reason: what is the use of a good cop without a bad one? There must be balance. Although this had caused the rate of killings within the Institute to soar, because of the cult wars that happened from time to time, causing a few geniuses to perish, it wasn't anything too serious, as it was a situation salvageable by the Institute. If the situation got worse, the Institute sent in a few powerhouses to clean them up, meaning to massacre 60 of the members in various cults before finally leaving. That was one of the disadvantages of joining a cult group. Also, one would stop receiving the full support of the Institute, which means the resources that would normally be given to a student would not be exceptionally given to a cultist member. That is also one of the disadvantages. But the advantages are quite good and the benefits are numerous. The F1 B4U cubic EMP normally could be bought within the Institute, as it was a necessary device for those who venture out on a mission to the outer world. It normally would cost 1,000 gyno points when bought through the system available by the Institute. But within the black market protected by several cults, it only cost half the price, 500 gyno points. From this, one could see the advantages and temptations of joining a cult. Everything within the black market cost half the price unless one gets scammed. That was the punishment for being truly ignorant. Seeing the cube, only one word desperately came into Dav's mind. Fuck. Fuck. The size of his legs instantly exploded in size. His heart constricted, skipping a beat. His muscles quivered like raging waves. Energy rushed into his very bones. Everything happened in that split second. Bam. He stomped his foot explosively as he retreated hastily. At the same moment, Lu Feng smirked when he saw this. He then flicked his fingers, hurling the blue cube straight towards the ground with a snicker. Crack! The electric blue ice cube hit the ground with a loud smash. The sound was akin to that of glass cup smashing toward the ground. Instantaneously, visible arcs of electricity exploded from the cube, parallel to the ground. It expanded with speed of light, forming a barely visible force field a 100-meter radius in the blink of an eye. Despite his efforts, Davy could only watch with wide eyes as the radius of the lightning arc passed through him. The barrier had been formed, then it went transparent as if the event hadn't taken place, but David knew better. He knew he was in danger this time. In less than 30 seconds, the whole 100-meter radius had gone silent. He couldn't even send in a distress signal, as no kind of sound waves or data could pass through the invisible barrier. From his forehead, tiny droplets of sweat could be seen, showing how incredibly tense he was. Without any warning, an electric current scurried down his spine, filling his back in an instant. The danger was right behind him. At this moment, a hand suddenly reached for David. It grabbed at his shoulders. Dav's expression changes slightly. He didn't even know when Lu Feng had reached his back. His body instantaneously reacted. Blood flowed into his veins with massive velocity as he twisted his shoulders slightly, evading the grab. Swoosh! He could feel the threatening force pass his shoulders. Right now, his side facing Lu Feng, he could vaguely see Lu Feng with the corner of his eyes. There wasn't enough time to change position. The time he needed to face Lu Feng was already enough for Lu Feng to deal with him. He had to find a way to salvage the situation. Every person had their strengths and weaknesses. Lu Feng was fast and also very strong. If he wanted to win, he had to display his strength to its fullest and use it to his advantage. This did not only apply to the opponent he was currently facing, it was also applicable to the opponents he would face in the future too. Using one's strength to counter others' weaknesses. This was the basic knowledge in combat. But in this case, what was his strength? A vague realization crossed his mind as he seemed to grasp it. He thought more thoroughly, and he figured it out suddenly as joy appeared in his heart. I have got it. My strength lies in my extreme body control. Previously, when the instructor had implied not everyone could control the muscles in their bodies perfectly, he had thought nothing of it. But when he also heard it from the theory lessons, he knew he was an exception as he could feel that the muscles, blood vessels, veins, and even his internal organs seemed to be under his control. He had been eager to test it specifically, but there just wasn't enough time. A 3 talent could just faintly control 50% of his overall muscles active in the body. but DAV felt as if he could control all his muscles perfectly. Even the control of the organs, which was usually quite difficult for even Powerhouse to control, he felt if he tried really hard, he could move them. It was inconceivable. He was simply a cheat, a bug-like existence. He was one of a kind. He had to use as little movements as possible to counter Lu Feng's speed. It was the idea that had suddenly popped up in his head. Swiftly making a decision, DAV hurried and leaped to the side. He didn't even retaliate, as he instinctively knew it was a waste of time. It would cause him harm instead. Dav's heart muscles constricted as it skipped a beat. His legs' muscles expanded. Instantly, he stomped his foot towards the ground with the force of a hammer, propelling him sideways. Threefold step. He shot sideways with amazing speed, but despite that, he still didn't feel the comfort he had expected. The chills down his spine remained there. Lu Feng had followed behind him like a specter at night. There was no way to fight at all. The explosive energy wasn't something he could withstand with his current body. This time, his expression had dropped by several levels. He had used the threefold technique, which directly increased his speed by 3 times. Yet, Lu Feng could still keep up with him. Doesn't this mean Lu Feng was at least 3 times stronger than him? There was a sudden whoosh. Another attack was coming behind him. It was a fist. This time, it was headed directly towards his head. This move was extremely vicious, as the opponent would have his skill broken with the force used if hit. All of a sudden, Dav's eyes flashed. It was like he had eye at the back of his head. With a gentle and soft movement of his head, he dodged the attack. Whoosh! An astonishingly powerful force passed his neck, missing it by a few centimeters, twirling the surrounding air with force. Lu Feng's exerted force missed its target. Not missing this chance, his body's placement, which was sideways, facing Lu Feng, twisted sideways in that moment. He was now facing Lu Feng directly. This made Lu Feng angry. His opponent did not have a higher blood revolution, which was as high as his, but was able to evade 2 of his attacks, and also use the opportunity to change position. It was like a slap to his face. Moreover, he had used a silencer device already, which made his heart ache. That amount of gyno points wasn't very easy for him to acquire. He still had 25 seconds left. He must end this humiliation this instant. Without hesitation, he exhaled at once and made a low shout. His muscles quivered as one could faintly hear the blood in his veins circulating with ferocity, almost like the faint roar of a flood dragon. Dark Dragon Claw. The Silencer series still had 25 seconds left before running low. He must end this humiliation this instant. Without hesitation, he exhaled at once and made a low shout. The muscles in his arms quivered as one could faintly hear the blood in his veins circulated, almost like the faint roar of a dragon. Dark Dragon Claws. Lu Feng's hands took the shape of a dragon's claw and performed a combat technique. His entire body lifted up as he soared in the air. He soared forwards as grabbed towards a vital part of David's body, his heart, where his second heart was located with his vicious attack. The claw was sharp and violent, incredibly ruthless. The wind formed by the claw released piercing sounds, leaving behind faint shadow. This was Lu Feng's peak performance, and any ordinary student would not be able to respond to that. However, his opponent was not an ordinary student. Dav's expression changed as he let out a yell. Blood rushed into his body with incredibly momentum. His arms budged twice as he managed to cross them. He felt an intense power smashing into his body like a moving mountain. He had used all the power in his veins and had blocked it instinctively, but he was tossed through the air. Dav's perception rotated as he was flung away. Twisting his waist arduously, he landed on the ground. He stamped his feet so hard on the ground, he could barely stabilize himself. His arms quivered beside him. It was hurting so bad he thought it was broken. He had to use his special rhythmic vibrating frequency to barely calm it. The opponent did not go easy on him. The explosive force which Lu Feng used was just too overbearing. One more time, and it was unknown if it was just his arms that would be breaking. Dav's sweat dripped all over him to the floor. As steam seemed to rise from his head, his skin was already red. showing the high level of blood activities operating within his body. He was completely exhausted. He had reached his limits. But he was not satisfied and would obviously not give up just like that. He was not resigned to this circumstance. He had had enough of people telling him what to do. He felt a sense of crisis. He raised his head instinctively. Lu Feng had attacked with another dark dragon claw. Dav inhaled deeply as anger flashed across his eyes. Blood seemed to rush into his head as he bellowed out in pure fury. Dav had gone berserk. Dark blood, red, tiny veins popped out his eyes as they seemed to shine dark red color. He flexed muscles hard as his heart contracted, skipping a beat instantaneously. Numerous dark veins the size of the pinky finger popped out, moving erratically around his body, akin to little naughty snakes. His muscles expanded explosively by almost 3 times again. Threefold step. But this time it wasn't his leg muscles that had expanded by almost 3 times, it was his arms. During the time that he was in class, he had briefly pondered whether he could use threefold step for his arms instead of his legs, but he had squashed that thought from his head almost immediately, as that was just his mischievous side clawing its way out. Using a combat technique meant for legs, using them for the arms was just asking to be crippled. Any single mistake in frequency and in blood, flowing to the wrong blood vessel or veins at the wrong time and at the wrong frequency the muscles were oscillating, it would result in a bloody mess. The flesh exploding. Although he had stopped the thought, his subconscious was still swayed by it. Right now, it was his rage and his pride controlling him as he seemed to have stopped thinking entirely. Dav's muscles trembled imperceptibly like raging waves. He stretched forward both of his fists suddenly, smashing them down at the incoming claws. Boom! The screeching sound was quite loud in the surroundings. The 2 ferocious attacks clashed fiercely. It was like the sounds of tempered steels colliding with one another. The moment the fist and the claw came into contact, Dav felt a great penetrating force barged into his body with intense momentum. Dav's body trembled violently, and he retreated 10 steps consequently. The ground trembled with each steps as he tried to negate the force rampaging his body. Lu Feng didn't have it good either and was made to retreat 3 steps. After their clash, it was obvious that Dav was still at a disadvantage, but things were different. He wasn't sent flying this time. Janine's mouth flew wide open as she stared, wearing a stunned expression, staring at David. Right now, her mind had gone blank. She herself didn't know the extent of Lu Feng's power, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could never receive a combat technique from him and remain the same. The force would thoroughly devastate her. Right now, Dav wasn't concerned about anything anymore. There was only one thing running through his mind, and that was the word fight. The moment they separated, Dav didn't wait any longer. He rapidly headed for Lu Feng this time. Lu Feng's eyes flew wide open in anger and humiliation. Nobody told him before he advanced towards David with another dark dragon claw. His fingers seemed to elongate as Lu Feng turned his hands into claws. The claw attacks appeared faintly indiscernible, but the killing intent penetrated through the air, turning the originally cold night more colder. Lu Feng's attacks were incredibly vicious and filled with a unique type of force, and he kept performing the killing move that others would find hard to withstand. However, Berserk David wasn't one to be underestimated either. Threefold step, or in this case, threefold strength. Dav used his arms and his legs to perform the threefold techniques. His moves were incredibly sleek and smooth, in contrast to his angry expression. He moved with agile steps and incredibly control, not wasting a single lot of energy, but sadly enough, that wasn't enough. For every move he countered, he had to step back for 10 steps before negating each forces, but Lu Feng didn't give him the opportunity to negate the unique force running rampant his body thoroughly. Before he could even make the 5th step, Lu Feng would swoop in like a crazy dragon, clawing towards his body with intense momentum. All this while, Dav had always trampled over his peers on Earth, no matter which situation it was. But by the time he crossed over to this world, this was the second time his peer would attempt to trample him. he was quite unwilling to allow that. His eyes radiated a strong battle intent as the light in his eyes shone. With a great roar, he tapped deep into the energy reserves contained within his body. His muscles bulged explosively as his body expanded. Visible veins the size of a little finger appeared all over his body, moving like scurrying snakes, and his muscles quivered in a peculiar rhythm. His body seemed to expand in size. He grew from a thin teenager into an almost 2-meter giant. He had somehow used threefold technique for the whole of his body. Roar! It was as if he had turned into a violent great ape. He bent his body like a great bow, and then, boom! He abruptly punched out. His fist smashed out towards Lu Feng's claws like a fierce heavenly hammer. Roar! It was as if he was a violent great ape. His aura surged as he faced off a wild and violent aura. Like a great beast of the wilderness, he bent his body just like an arrow to a bow, and then, boom! He abruptly punched out. His fist screamed through the air with friction, and he smashed out towards Lu Feng's claws like a fierce heavenly hammer. Seeing this, Lu Feng's expression changed greatly. Dav's current momentum was incredibly fierce and savage, like he could crush him with just a single strike. There wasn't much thoughts needed. He shouted in a low voice as he performed his trump card. His claws morphed into fists as he also punched out. Black Dragon's Decree. Boom! It was like heavenly judgment on earth. Visible shockwave spread through the air between Dav and Lu Feng. The air crackled. Surging winds shook the surroundings, and even the force field EMP that had been installed seemed to flash in and out of existence, lighting the surroundings environment blue in color. Dav's huge body and Lu Feng's body remained still for a short moment. Abruptly, they were flung backwards simultaneously by their own force. Dav flew through the air like a projectile. He seemed to have lost all of his strength as his muscles shrank back to their previous size. His body also became smaller in the air as he returned to his previous positions. Bam, bam, bam. He landed towards the ground without any form of elegance. His body bounced 3 times on floor before sliding backwards a few meters, after which it came to a skidding stop. Right now, Dav's current state was extremely dangerous and quite pitiful. He had been knocked out cold. Dark red blood profusely dripped out from his lips to the ground. His body trembled imperceptibly while his muscles quivered like waves. His expression was currently furrowed, as if he was experiencing a great pain. Light groans could be heard from his lips. Lu Feng's situation was still a lot better than David's. His clothes were tattered all over, and blood could be seen dripping down his perfect lips. His previously perfectly combed and gelled hair had scattered all over with dust and sand in them. Sweat dripped continuously from his head, but his handsome face was incredibly twisted. He was angry. He was incredibly incensed. He had never once been in a situation like this one before. Who was he? Lu Feng, a terrific 4-star prodigy. He is the proud and incredible prodigy in genetics. The Institute had personally told him that he had hopes of advancing to the level of the Grand Professor, and if he was diligent and could overcome his peers, that he could be under the Grand Prof as an intern. That was the first step if he wants to become the next Grand Prof of the Institute. Those were his ambitions and dreams, as he was an incredibly ambitious person. He aimed straight to the top. But what had happened to him now? He had been beaten back and had even failed to handle an individual with blood cycles no higher than 50 cycles per minute. It was a huge disgrace for him, and if word was to get out, he would have no face nor reputation left to protect. All his ambitions would turn to smoke. Visible but untouchable. Real but yet unreal. He would surely be doomed. Anger shone through his eyes as glared at David, who was unconscious a few tens of meters away. He shot forwards towards David, just like a moving phantom. Dav was defenseless now. There was nothing he could do to defend himself, as he was unconscious. If nothing was done to stop Lu Feng, it was unlikely anything good would come out of it. Wait! As he moved, a tender but loud voice pierced through the atmosphere like the siren's call. It was Janine. Lu Feng suddenly stopped in his tracks. He turned to face Janine, glaring at her for the sudden intrusion. "What do you mean?" He questioned her with anger apparent in his tone. Janine shivered as she instinctively took a step back. I think he has passed the range of the EMP. Janine explained as she stuttered. Lu Feng's eyes darkened as he observed his surroundings for confirmation. 100 meters was an incredibly short amount of space to fight, but Lu Feng had though he could finish his opponent off without even going through half of the distance. He checked through his imprint, only to realize that it was true. David was currently just a few meters away from the EMP's range of coverage. At most, 5 seconds are all it took to cover such distance, but Lu Feng had thought he had things under control, but he was clearly wrong. If he stretched his hands, Lu Feng could even touch him and could possibly bring back him into the range of the silencer, as there were still 7 seconds left, but he knew better, and he also dared not to try it. David's imprint had already disconnected from the Institute's server, which was already suspicious. If it happened again within the span of 24 hours, there would be emergency backup, and it would be a powerhouse that would show up in that instant. He dared not to try anything. His expression turned savage as he shouted with gritted teeth. He almost couldn't accept this situation. Even though he got what he was originally planning on doing to David, as he had planned to beat him into a pulp and then render him unconscious, he wasn't satisfied in the slightest. But there was obviously nothing he could do about it. "Bastard, you want to escape next time? I will make sure of it," Lu Feng said, word for word. That was his last words. Turning toward Janine, he said, "Let's go." 7 seconds were enough to erase most traces of battles that had taken place. He had used a unique contraption he had gotten especially for this type of situations. As it was low-leveled, it couldn't erase all the deep traces, but as long as the Institute didn't personally investigate the matter, there was nothing to worry about. Investigations in this era was very thorough. They could even use the unique heat frequency one's bodily heat changes to recognize the culprit. Lu Feng left with Janine as quickly as they had arrived, as if they weren't there in the first place. It was a bit past 3 a.m. in the midnight when David came to. He groaned miserably as he tried to prop himself up with his hands, but was unable to do so. Extreme pain shot through his very bones. At this moment, he felt as if his body was entirely made out of jelly. He felt as though he had undergone the most vigorous training that existed. His arms were awfully sore. The muscles in his arms were even twitching by themselves, barely listening to his stand-up. From another's point of view, David's condition was quite terrible. His body contained several bloody tears and lacerations because of the fragile outer veins, meridians, and blood vessels rupturing, which was caused by the inappropriate usage and the abuse they had gone through. In simple terms, it was because he had used a taboo technique, a technique meant solely for the lower limbs. He had utilized it using his upper body, which caused some of his blood vessels to rupture by the sheer amount of velocity, speed, and power his blood had been circulating at. It was a miracle his major blood vessel wasn't badly damaged. David could be said to have luckily survived a disaster. What he had done was unprecedented and nothing short of a miracle. Although he wasn't the first desperate person in the Institute to think and use idea of using a leg technique for his arms, he was the only one that had survived after the initial exponential increase in strength and the burst in power. Others before him had died shortly after their battles due to excessive blood loss, internal bleeding, and the rupturing of several major veins that pumps blood to the heart. Those could be healed in a few minutes if the Institute got involved, but despite that, the victim still dies due to the fact that they lost control as the beastly characteristics would choose that moment to erupt. The main reason David survived was simply because of his talent, absolute body control. The most amazing ability any powerful being would desperately wish for. As a result, the repercussions of using a technique incorrectly was mostly negated, but still, there were still some negative effects that had occurred in his body. But that wasn't enough to cause that much bloody tears on his body. One wouldn't know how extraordinary one was unless when compared to others. He was literally almost a bloody mess right now. Looking at the time, he was unconscious for almost 8 hours. Perform a full body scan. David's dry voice rang out as he decisively spoke with the AI. Accurate full-body scan will cost 100 gyno points. Do you wish to continue? The cybernetic voice replied. Dav's expression changed slightly. 100 gyno points was no small amount to him or any new students of the Institute, but still, he had to know the full extent of his injuries to find the means of curing them fully without leaving some out. In the Institute, it was absolutely free, and it cost nothing to make a full body scan at the Institute's infirmary, but the result of the scan would be straight up sent to the Institute, and the secret he himself wasn't sure he had would surely be exposed to the Institute: his absolutely body control. The Institute won't miss such a fine specimen and would spare no efforts at obtaining him. He wouldn't even be able to resist, and his disappearance in the Institute wouldn't even cause the slightest ripple in the hegemony called the Institute. Making the AI perform a full body scan on him would save time and effort, and at the same time, the result of the full body scan would be absolutely confidential unless he wished to release it to the Institute. He would be rewarded with a few gyno points, though. DAV replied positively. In that brief moment, a few blurry rays of lights that were like lasers swept through his body. DAV felt tiny bits of electric current spread through his entire body. He shivered slightly in pleasure. The feeling was akin to being high on drugs or on the peak of climax. Almost as if he was high on ecstasy, it was a stark contrast with the pain and soreness he had been feeling a brief moment ago. He couldn't hold it in as a slight moan escaped his lips. Body scan complete. Do you wish to see the results now? The robotic voice broke his moment as the initial euphoria faded. Sighing slightly, yes, show me, he replied. Some bits of energy had filled his body due to the initial body scan. Interruption in blood circulation and internal bleeding is the main cause of unconsciousness. Other diagnosis includes internal tremor, essential tremor, functional impairment of the neurons, central nervous system disorders, damaged reticular formations, tachycardia, acridism, cerebral concussion, minor blood vessels laceration, tiny bone fracture, whiplash, knee trauma. Just stop. DAV shook his head because he was getting increasingly dizzy by the minute. What was this all about? The only few things he understood was the first few sentences. The rest was just alien language to him. Just give me the rough estimate of my condition. David interrupted and started moving forwards. In just a few moments, the AI reply came and scan revealed that user has multiple bone fractures, internal bleeding, essential tremor of the organs, interruption of the blood circulation, several veins burst, muscle straining, blood loss, etc. The most injury which seemed severe was the overworking of the hearts, which had almost led to a heart attack and organ collapse caused by performing an higher-grade combat technique or by abusing the limits of a combat technique. The robotic voice rang out in his head. David took some time to ponder. He was truly lucky this time. A heart attack for a Spryher basically means death, because it was at that moment the second heart's genetic characteristics would strike, and if one was not very careful, one might just lose control. Solution includes submerging into the energy tank for a few hours. It would help heal the external and interwounds. For better recovery, it is advisable to add a vial of serum, as there seemed to be a 50% chance of losing control. His injuries could be said to be serious and also not that severe. Dav's eyebrow locked together upon hearing this. Serums are expensive stuffs. Not just anyone could afford it, but he had no choice if he wanted to recover quickly, avoiding the fate of losing control. If he left his body to recover itself, it might take up several weeks of his time, as he would be unable to practice. His blood circulation would not increase during this period, and he would remain stagnant, left behind by his peers, which was quite unacceptable by him. The position he had risked his life for would surely be taken from him. It would surely be a disappointing outcome. Coming out of his thoughts, he headed towards the energy room with slow steps. Almost every step caused him quite a bit of pain, causing his face to distort. There is something which is uncertain to be mentioned. He raised his eyebrow in question to the AI's words. What is it? The level of neurological activity and brainwaves activities in the body seem to be more than 10 times higher than every living organism record in the database. It could be a systematic error that led to such conclusions, but if it is not, This could be a huge discovery that could help humanity in some ways. If you could submit the result to the Institute, the least amount of gyno points estimated to be given is 20,000 gyno points. Do you wish to proceed with the submission process? David's head was at first blank, after which he was stunned, and then frantically, he hurriedly shouted no. Sending the result to the Institute was just serving him to wolves on golden platter. He wouldn't even know how he died. What huge discovery that could help humanity. It was just a sure death sentence. He would find a way to assist humanity, but definitely not this way. Cough, cough. He had used too much force to shout out loud. That was how terrified he had been. He didn't have any perverse wish to become an experimental subject. David hurriedly headed towards the energy room. He needed to recuperate for a while as his injuries was quite severe. He still had a bit over 3 hours left to his next lecture, so he needed to use every second of it to recuperate. 3 hours later, the sun shone brightly as David exited the energy room, feeling a bit better. The injuries he had sustained from his fight were more or less serious. His internal organs had been shaken due to the tremor and, according to the full-body diagnosis made by the system, the list of his injuries were quite long. He hadn't made a full recovery yet. However, he had healed up nicely enough to attend class without causing himself pain or making the injuries worse. He wasn't at all hungry since he had just soaked in the energy tank. He was filled to the brim with energy. So, he headed for his class, immediately calling forth a sky cruiser. He was happy it wasn't the person he had met the first time. The lecture was quite long and boring, as David was too tired to listen. Such things were torture for him in his condition. In the Institute, it was important to attend lectures, as every lecture missed leads to a reduction in points for the final examination. Although the points or credits deducted would be quite negligible, once it piled up it could cause a headache. DAV hurriedly left the hall after the lecture and headed for his room. This time, there was no accident and no one stopped him since he practically ran to his room, ignoring everything and everyone. A few minutes later, David was quietly sitting in his room, closing his eyes. When he opened them, he appeared quite relaxed and calm, as if nothing could ever shake him. Reaching for the metallic box in front of him, he opened it to reveal a syringe as small as an index finger. The syringe was the serum had spent 100 gyno points to obtain. It had been sent and had arrived through the transporter at his room. The box had been locked as it requires his identity tag, which is printed in his wrist to open. Inside the syringe, the black liquid flowed fluidly without leaving a single stain or smear of liquid on the body of the syringe, as there seemed to be little stats hidden within. It was a bit of a fascinating sight. David didn't care for this. The fear of losing control was the most important right now. Without warning, David suddenly stabbed at his thigh with the syringe, injecting then liquid into his body. A faint force appeared within his body. DAV discarded the empty syringe and closed his eyes. He quickly focused on the force, not giving the sensation time to fade. The force was slowly circulating along with flow of blood in his body, urging every cells in his body to move, accelerating their activities by an impressive amount. His body began to itch as though there were thousands of ants gnawing at his flesh, veins, and internal organs. But it was bearable. The injuries in his body began healing at a fast pace. The tears in his veins, which had already been healed when he had gone to the energy room, also healed all over again. The flesh wounds he had gotten from the fight began to heal at an eye-catching pace. Although very slowly, in a matter of a few minutes, the wounds closed up nicely and scabbed over slowly. DAV felt the strange force enter his heart through his veins. His heart gradually turned a little hot, causing quite the discomfort. It returned to normal after a while. But David was disappointed to see the strange force started fading fast, until it finally disappeared. David opened his eyes, feeling quite refreshed and satisfied. Although he felt quite pain spending 100 gyno points on his healing, the outcome was quite satisfactory. Suddenly, his eyes turned cold. Lu Feng, you just wait and see. A cold flint flashed in his eyes. He had been a little naive previously and had thought his life would be a little peaceful, and had even taken things as a joke on his first day. But now he had realized how serious his situation in the institute was. Any small thing could lead to death. The whole while, his life had been hanging by a thread, but he had been ignorant. As he could remember, he had almost died 3 times while in the institute. The first time was when he had gone to the center to get his talent graded. If he lied about the fact that he was a 3-star talented student, the bracelet would have killed him, as his sensitivity would have been very high. The second time was when he had fought with Janine. At first, he thought it was a normal battle, but as he recalled the situation he was in back then, he couldn't help but shake his head at his ignorant self. If he hadn't practiced the 3-fold step then, he might have been dead or possibly crippled. The third time was with Lu Feng. The genius Asian-looking young man was way too strong. He didn't bother hiding his killing intent and struck sinisterly for the kill. Almost every single attack was a combat technique. Even when he had performed a taboo combat technique, he had still been sent flying. David's blood began to boil in anger. He had taken things far too easily. Now he was hoping not to make the same mistake. Calming his emotions, there was something he needed to check first. When he got in the red grade combat technique and had practiced it, his thoughts at that time was that his rate of improvement was too slow compared to the genius who had taken over half a year to practice to the prosaic state. The first level of every technique was called the prosaic state, including the black-brown or red grade technique. Due to his ignorance, he had thought the final level of the technique was called the prosaic state. That was why he had assumed he was very slow in his practicing. But now he had gotten to know that the first level that had taken a 5-star genius of the Institute 6 months to learn had only taken him just 2 days master. He was put to quite the shock. He had never once thought himself as a genius, but this was just too overwhelming. In truth, the reason for that was because of the ability he has, the ability to freely control each and every part of his body at will. And also because he had divided the red grade technique into multiple pieces and also mastered each of them to perfection, washer, able to learn the technique so quickly. If the 5-star genius had some that, instead of practicing it together, it might not have even taken 3 months to master it. Opening up his personal interface, he clicked on his library while taking a book out from it. Before the fight with Lu Feng had taken place, David had gone to the school's archive to select a combat technique manual and an exercise manual, which increases the blood revolution limits in the body. He had planned on practicing at least one of them to the first level last night, but his plans were ruined, and with his injuries, he wasn't able to. But now that they had healed, it was the best time to practice them. Time waits for no one. If he doesn't hurry to get stronger, he might really be left behind by his peers and possibly lose his life in this cruel place. Janine and Lu Feng wouldn't be the only people to covet his position. Others would eventually come swarming in sooner or later. The exercise manual David had gotten from the archive. Since it was free select only one from the Institute, he didn't have to pay to get it. Formless heat, a black grade training method that utilizes the heat produced from the body to increase the blood circulation in the body. Formless heat contains 3 levels. When practiced to the highest level, users' combat power will increase by a small margin along with the increase in body's temperature, using the first law of thermodynamics, converting the heat energy to strengthen the body. For example, when in combat, the increase in the bodily temperature is an inevitable phenomenon during combat or an exercise. The training manual uses the intense heat produced by the friction in the body to increase one's strength by raising the blood circulation and blood revolution limit in the body. As a result, consumes more stamina, gathers the body's heat to forcibly propel the blood, leading to an increase in blood revolution. Warning: only allowed once per day during the beginning stages. Failure to heed to the warning might result to a heart attack or heart failure, as the heart might not be able to withstand the velocity of blood flow. David's expression changed slightly as he saw the description. It was totally different from what he was expecting. It was still better if all it did was increase his strength at the final stage. What David found unacceptable was the fact that it reduces one's stamina. During his fight with Lu Feng, he had figured out the importance of stamina in a fight. It was unknown what the outcome of the battle would be if his stamina was just a tiny bit lower during the fight. Even if he was twice as strong, he doubted he would be a match. It wasn't a matter of underestimating himself. It was the plain truth. David hesitated. His gaze then hardened as he decided to practice the exercise manual. Although he wasn't entirely safe, he still had about a week of safety left. That is if he was careful. Clang, clang. Firming his resolve, David's room expanded by almost 3 times its previous size as sounds of machinery echoed from his room. Circulating the threefold step, his leg muscles twanged like the sound of a bowstring as it reverberated almost like the breathe of a fierce tiger. They quivered with force as his muscles oscillated like the waves of a river with a specific frequency. 42 cycles per minute. His heartbeat quickened as the sound of a heart beating and his blood slouching could be faintly heard from the room. Suddenly, his heart constricted. His legs' muscles instantly exploded in size. Veins the size of one's finger wriggled like live snakes as he took a large stride forwards. Whoosh! Threefold step. Without warning, he shot forwards like a bullet, with amazing speed as he was instantly propelled forwards by the force that exploded from his legs. No, it wasn't threefold this time. It should be called the fourfold step. It seems as though the battle had benefited him by quite a bit. He had instantly moved by almost 4 times his previous speed. It was quite astonishing. He stopped only after executing the technique until he was at his peak state. His breathing was rough as the technique consumed quite a lot of energy from him. But he kept propelling his blood as his heart kept beating at a very fast pace. 42 cycles per minute. The reason he executed threefold step was because the training manual requires the body to be of a high temperature to successfully train in the method. And also he was testing to see if there were any hidden danger left in his body before practicing the exercise manual. But it seems to be all right. There seemed to be no problem with his body. David took in a deep breath as his chest puffed out. He seemed to hear the blood flow in his body like a river, accompanied with the beating of his heart like the tempo of a drum. Abruptly, he shivered as the muscles in his body quivered. The room's temperature seemed to have gone down by several degrees. His heart suddenly felt a bit pained and was rapidly growing hot. It was in stark contrast to his body temperature as his breathing turned ragged. His heartbeat suddenly quickened by a margin and felt as though it was about to leap out from his chest. It was very uncomfortable. His body felt extremely cold after performing the technique. But the strength which filled his body at that moment clouded his pain. He had grown a bit stronger in just a few breaths of time. It was euphoric. His body seemed to be brimming with energy, and he also felt his body surging with great strength. He clenched his fists. The air trapped within seemed to crackle in celebration. According to his calculations, he had grown stronger by almost 5%. It was incredibly. If he continued with the practice multiple times a day, and his strength kept growing by 5%, he would leave his peers in the dust in no time. But it was a pity he could only afford to practice the exercise once a day. If one checked his body temperature at that moment, it had reduced by 40 degrees, 51 blood revolution per minute. If one checked his body temperature at that moment, it had reduced by 40 degrees. The technique had utilized most of the heat generated from his body to spike up an increase in his heartbeat. But in just a few seconds, his body temperature swiftly reverted back to its normal measure as they rapidly absorbed the hot air contained in the surrounding atmosphere. Before he had started practicing the exercising manual, he had spoken to the AI, which provided him with a hot temperature environment. The reason for that was because the exercise manual gathers all the heat in the body and using it to forcibly spike an increase in heart rate. It was a very dangerous process that requires delicate and fine control of the muscles and also blood. That exact moment was the most dangerous part in the execution of the practice. If the body's temperature failed to increase during that period of time, some of the most important organs in the body would fail to operate, which would lead to death of the person. You might think that performing an exercise manual was easy, simple, and safe, but in fact, it was quite the opposite. There are a lot of instances where a slight mistake and a lot of situations that could lead to your death once you start practicing. Every exercise manual contains a certain amount of danger. A simple blood flow in the wrong veins could lead to internal bleeding. Oscillating the muscles at the wrong frequency could rupture the whole muscle system, and even the nerves, resulting in one being crippled. There's always a certain amount of price you would pay if you want to gain power. David let out a breath of turbid air. His eyes rolled rapidly. He was thinking. The warning contained in the technique clearly stated that at the beginning stages, you can only perform the practice once in a day. But David felt that with the absolute control he had over his body, he could perform at most 5 sets OD formless heat before his heart and body reach its limits. It was an inconceivable thought, but as the owner of his body, he knew what was best for his body and also knew where his body's limit lies. He hesitated because it might just be a misconception of his because he had grown a bit stronger. The Institute only has a high-grade black tier combat manual. He no longer hesitated. In just a span of 20 minutes, the temperature of his body lowered by a few degrees 4 more times and also rose back to its normal temperature, absorbing the surrounding heat. David was keeping it safe. He didn't want to cause harm to his body, just for the sake of growing stronger. If his body was injured, it might slow down his progress instead, controlling his heart rate to its normal measure. He focused on the strength he had gained. According to one's calculations, his strength should have increased by at least 25%. But David felt it was a little lower than that. It seems the more one circulated the formless heat, the lesser the effect would be, since his body was gradually getting used to the process. He had meditated on his fight with Lu Feng, and he realized that he lacked an attack combat technique and also experience in fighting. Lu Feng had performed a total of 2 combat technique during that night, which was obviously at the prosaic state, while he only had an evasive technique that increases his speed. It was his stubbornness, or as he would call it, his willpower that saved him. Turning his holographic image on, his fingers swiftly tapped on the structure of light, after which he brought out a book whose structure is made of a few clusters of lights. Scorching Fury, a high-tier black-grade combat technique that infuses every move made by the user with an explosive force which contains a burning sensation. Contains 3 levels. When practiced to the 3rd level, every punch and kicks have a 70% chance of burning the affected area. When practiced to the perfection state, burning blood, the explosive power and scorching heat contained within one's fist could be used to roughly temper a block of black iron. Every move made will be double its attack power. The reason David had chosen this technique was because it could assist him in practicing his training manual for a long time. Continuing to use his body's heat would eventually lead to a problem, so he chose a combat technique that could help him produce that heat. And also, he had decided to follow just one path. He knew his temper well, which was as unrestrained as fire itself, so choosing the formless heat was the perfect choice for him. Moreover, since he had chosen an exercise manual with the fire attribute, he then proceeded to select a combat technique with the same attribute, as it might superimpose, which would lead to an increase in his strength. A few minutes later, David threw the book back into his imprint. He had memorized the entire instructions contained within Scorching Fury. It was only at this moment did he realize that his intelligence had somehow grown by a lot. Although he could confidently say that he was intelligent, he had never gotten last place in any of his classes. He was always placed second to the last night place. But it wasn't this exaggerated. He had memorized the entire technique in a matter of a few minutes. It was a lot surprising to him as he had just noticed this. Suddenly, a rumbling sound could be heard from his room as his chest rumbled. Thump, thump, thump. His heartbeat rose as blood circulated through his entire system. Strength and energy filled his entire body. The massive 20% increase in strength still felt a bit strange and awkward, but oddly comforting to him. Executing Scorching Fury, the muscles in his arms quivered, growing hot rapidly as they oscillated in a particular frequency. His blood surged faster and faster, directing them according to what was written on the formula. His heartbeat continued to rise until it reached its limit. 51 CPM. 1 cycle per minute. Executing Scorching Fury, the muscles in his arms quivered, growing hot rapidly as they oscillated in a particular frequency. His blood surged faster and faster, directing them according to what was written on the formula. His heartbeat continued to rise until it reached its limit, 51 cycle per minute. Without warning, he punched out. Boom! A soft booming sound echo bounced off David's walls as a slightly visible heat waves could be seen surging out from his fists, the air distorted from the heat that emerged from his fist. But David wasn't satisfied with it, since nothing had happened to the black iron puppet. Not waiting for the euphoria to fade, he threw out a second punch, a third, a fourth. He continued to punch out using the scorching fury. As David continued to execute the combat technique, the heat wave emerging from his fist became more and more visible with each fist thrown out. If one were to look at David, one could see his stances becoming more and more refined as his fist proceeded to tear through the air. The heat waves that were formerly scattered and all over the place were becoming a bit more condensed around his fist compared to his previous punches. Prosaic state in just 2 minutes. From his normally 2 punches per 3 seconds, it gradually grew by the minute. If it were a normal punch, without the use of combat technique, any random spryher in the Institute could easily break the world record back on Earth. But the activation of a technique takes a significant amount of time to circulate the blood and oscillate the correct frequency and also heartbeat. Everything must be right. So in this situation, it was considered very good to execute a technique in 3 seconds when you just started training it. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. David's punch got quicker and faster as the temperature in the room rose at a fast pace. He was like an angry beast, raining punches at the puppet like a mad beast in a swift but savage manner. Sweat dripped down his forehead like rain, while some were already evaporating in a slow pace due to the heat. But David didn't care. He continued executing scorching fury. David's eyes flashed with a brilliant glow and without hesitation. "Huh!" David shouted, and then, without caution, he took a large stride forward. His heart that was beating as fast as a piston suddenly constricted. Not even waiting for a second, his leg muscles shook and it expanded by almost 4 times its previous size. Whoosh! 3-fold step. But that wasn't all. Scorching fury. His muscles burned as his blood suddenly grew very hot and painful. To ease his pain, his legs swept at the human-shaped steel made of black iron. Black iron human puppet, not far from him. He kicked with full force, releasing the energy threatening to burst out. Boom! An explosive sound thundered outwards. The air cracked with thunder as the earth shook like an earthquake. Dense visible ripples of shock waves and heat wave exploded out with terrifying force as steel shards shot out in all and every direction. David's kick had crushed almost half of the steel's head. Scorched marks could be seen as it covered the remaining half of the black iron human puppet. The hot temperature only melted a few scraps of iron at the edge of the human-shaped iron puppet. David's face paled and was immediately sent flying by a terrifying force. He was thrown to the ground while panting loudly. He had exhausted all of his strength in that final attack. Ha ha! David suddenly burst into laughter. He was very satisfied with his own accomplishments. He finally had a trump card he could finally call his own. Scorching fury together with 3-fold step. That combo was simply too terrifying. He was certain that if he met Lu Feng right now and manages to catch him off guard with the move, even if Lu Feng has twice his previous strength, he would certainly be gravely injured if he tried to counter Scorching Kick. But it was obvious he couldn't execute the move for more than 3 times, or his veins and nerves would be scorched by the temperature. Even if he has extreme control over his body, there was nothing he could do to protect his organ. If one day his body grew strong enough to withstand such usage and temperature, he could freely use it. But until then, David clenched his fist tightly. He finally had the strength to protect himself, even if it was just from his classmates who were constantly chasing after his life and his position on the rankings list. It was just the beginning, though. Although there's still a lot of new students that are stronger and more capable than Lu Feng, they wouldn't be interested in a position as low as the 7th place. The image of a female student suddenly flashed past his mind, Phillida. He didn't know how strong she would be right now, but he could guess her strength should have surged by a lot, but he wasn't going to underestimate himself. If he too was pushed to his limits, he could temporarily gain the strength to fight back, but not without a heavy cost. David then recollected circulating threefold step with his entire body. At that time, although he couldn't remember much of what had happened due to his anger, what he knew was that he had his sudden surge in strength. What if he executed threefold step with his wild body without regards, and then simultaneously also executed scorching fury? The increase in strength would be devastating. David suddenly shook his head. His perception and his sensitivity of his body told him that he would certainly be the first person to die from internal heat if he tried doing that. He was beginning to trust his instincts even more than he did himself. Scorching kick. That was what he named as the moves. Do not blame him. He has had a bad naming sense ever since he could remember. That might be the one thing which would reign constant on this life. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next day, David stepped out of the hall and headed towards his next class, which was actually combat lessons. He could walk there since there was more than enough time to get to the field before the lesson starts. Hey, David. DAV turned his head towards the person who called out his name. Standing beside David as they continued to walk, Nihia smiled as he said, I didn't see you yesterday. Did summoning happen? Towards Nihia's question, DAV glanced sideways at Nihia and was about to reply, but he weirdly stopped. DAV frowned as he took another glance at Nihia. Something flashed in his eyes for a second before it retreated afterwards. Although it happened in a split second, but strangely, Nihia caught on. Is there something on my face? He asked, running his face with his hands. David retracted his gaze as he nonchalantly replied, There was, but the breeze blew it off already, so don't worry about it. And also, I was having a few problems with my training method, but it's all good now. That was the reason why I was unavailable yesterday, DAV said, but not without stealing another glance at Nihia, as his frown couldn't help but deepen. He could only hope that what his instincts told him was wrong. The duo arrived at the field where the lessons was going to take place with Nihia charging in tow. There were other students that had gotten there earlier before them. David scanned the field with his eyes. He saw some other students who he could recognize. His gaze lingered on Nick for a second, but before he retracted it. His gaze suddenly hardened when he saw the figure of a person. It was Janine, and she was chatting with other male fellow students flocking around her all the while, smiling cutely. One wouldn't help but admire her beauty as her fingers twirled around her blazing red hair. It was a magnificent sight. But David was still filled with anger to notice such details. His hands itched to gift her a punch, but he contained himself while he checked her immediate surroundings, but to no avail. He couldn't find the person he was really looking for, which was Lufone. Suddenly, as if feeling the gaze of someone lingering on her for too long, she looked over towards David. And as she who it was, her expression turned rather ugly while she tried concealing it quickly. But the people with her were exceptionally sharp students. They noticed a change in her expression. Whale, a very handsome black-skinned youth with an exceptionally huge figure, frowned when he noticed. With that, he asked, Is anything the matter, Janine? You look somewhat uncomfortable. Without waiting for her to reply, Whale glanced towards the direction she had faced before as he squinted his eyes towards David's position. Is it that skinny guy over there? Did he do anything to you? The other students with her also had a slight frown on their faces as they faced Janine with a questioning look. At first she denied it, but since they insist, she explained he is called David Syntax and is currently holding the 7th position on the rookies' rankings list. Upon hearing this, the others all nodded as they looked at David's figure in a new light. Those whose name are on the rankings list, although some are not very powerful, they still possess a considerable amount of strength. So what's the problem? Whale was confused. Janine's expression then turned sour as she continued. I had impeached him, hoping to negotiate with him by buying the position from him. I told him I will pay any price for it, but he actually wanted to take advantage not of me. I had no other choice than to initiate a forced duel with him. Who would have expected him to sneak an attack on me? At the end of her speech, tears threatened to spill out of her eyes. This immediately infuriated the male students around her. But they weren't stupid people. Among those that are in the institute, less than 20% were dim-witted. They immediately saw through her lies, but still, there had to be some truth in her words. Therefore, David was at fault no matter what. Nehia and David had just settled at a position on the soft grass of the field, when suddenly David felt several piercing sensations down his spine. He immediately looks back and saw the several male students with Janine earlier glaring daggers at him. David couldn't care less about them, as his body didn't even react to their threat. It was only a single individual among them that gave him a slight reaction, the black dude that was currently heading over towards his direction. David's expression turned ugly instantly. Janine had done it again. It seemed she likes other people doing her dirty job. This was the second time someone had come, wanting to battle him for her sake, and honestly, it was getting a little frustrating. Whale headed towards David as he stretched forth his hands in greeting. "I'm Whale, what's your name?" Whale asked with a smile. A little confused, David stood up, shaking hands with Whale. He knew something was up with the scenario, even without his primal instincts warning him. But he couldn't tell what it was, as he couldn't figure it out. He would just take whatever came his way. Stretching forth his hand, they clasped hands. Upon seeing this, the students shook their heads upon the naivety of this fellow student called David, actively daring to shake hands with Whale. That is just asking for his bones to be crushed. Nehia just stood to the side, watching the drama unfold with an expressionless face, seemingly having no intention of supporting David at all. Whale had gained a nickname within the short period of time he had been in the Institute. Hands of Steel, which is related to the combat technique manual he had chosen, Metallic Palm, a low-tier black-grade combat technique manual. Gradually transmute the hands to be as hard as metal itself. When trained to the highest level, one's hand will shine with a metallic luster and could easily crush stones to powder with the hands alone. Obviously, Whale hadn't practiced to that stage yet. He had only reached the prosaic state, 1. But still, his hands could crush the fragile bones in one's finger. He had used this technique to secure the 9th place for himself in the rankings just recently. As David clasped hands with Whale, he felt as though his hands had been locked in place with a vice grip, too. His expression changed slightly as he felt a forced squeeze at his hand, threatening to crush it. Whale only smiled as he pushed his blood circulation and also activating the combat Techno-K, Metallic Palm, and continued to increase the force in his grip. David's expression loosened as he also pushed his blood circulation, urging his blood while his strength continued to rise as he forcefully resisted Whale's Metallic Palm with his strength alone. It should be known that Dav's blood revolution had reached a terrifying 53 cycle per minute, almost at the bottleneck of 1 cycle per second, a stage where one can decide either to continue increasing his or her blood revolutions or advance to the next stage. Advancing to the next stage while at a blood revolution on 1 cycle per second would result in a successful breakthrough. But those that advance at that level can never hope to compete with those that advance with a 3 CPS 3 in strength. The more blood revolutions you have when you can circulate, the more strength you gain when you advance. DAV smirked. I'm David Syntax. 1. Beginner state. 2. A tool or machine specifically used to clamp or hold wood or steel for cutting or filling. 3. Cycles per second. David looked at him and chuckled. I'm David Syntax. The spectators were surprised as they failed to realize what was going on. Every person who had dared to shake hands with Whale all retreated with fractured bones in a matter of seconds, but obviously, David was still fine and even had the strength to laugh even after it was almost a minute. I don't think Whale is using his full strength yet. Someone couldn't help but say, yeah, maybe he has developed a new hobby of slowly torturing his prey. Another guessed. The other students nodded their heads in agreement. It wasn't weirdly that a person could develop a new habit. It happens often if one chose a path that was a bit non-suitable. Whale's expression shifted as saw that force he was executing wasn't enough to deter David. Intact, David looked to be comfortable. Whale immediately increased his force output to 80%. Meanwhile, he sneered, let's see how you can remain smiling with over 80% of my power together with my metallic palm. Propelling his blood further, newfound strength empowered him as he increased the power in his hands. There was a slight creaking sound as the power of their hands colliding increased. What was slightly unexpected is that despite Whale increasing his strength further, David could still remain smiling despite the situation. This made Whale frown slightly as the outcome he was expecting didn't happen. His face grew dark. Angrily, he glared at David with cruelty in his eyes, and immediately, he pushed his blood circulation to the limit. The euphoric sound of his heart pumping and the intoxicating feeling of strength filling his body invaded him. He still couldn't get used to it. He wanted every opportunity to feel this moment, and together with the sound of his opponents screaming for mercy. It was an exhilarating feeling for him. He wasn't a mindless idiot that would cause trouble for a girl who might not even consider dating him. But if she did consider him after he defeated this opponent, it was the legendary killing two birds with one stone. With a sneer, he activated his combat technique, Metallic Palm, with full force, not bothering to hold back anymore, because it seems his opponent has a little bit of ability. Whale's hands shone slightly with a dark color that shows that he had activated his combat technique. Oh, it seems this guy had a bit of ability to resist hands of steel to this point, a young-looking spectator said when he saw the sheen on Whale's hand, clearly speaking about David's ability to resist Whale. Indeed, he has already forced Whale to activate his combat technique. It's worth praising him for. I don't think it would last much longer anymore. Another student shook his head in pity. Why do you say so? One person asked. Whale's technique has surpassed the first state and had already reached the second state. Dark sheen. The guy said as a matter of fact. Really? The others gasped in amazement. For one's combat technique to reach the second state in such a short time they had been in the Institute, it is indeed an amazing feat. It showed how talented Whale is. 5 seconds passed, nothing. 10 seconds passed, still nothing. The audience began to notice that something was wrong with the situation. But after another 5 seconds passed, Whale suddenly felt a foreign force invading his palms, which was impossible. He doubted if it was his mind's playing tricks on him. One of the advantages of Metallic Palm is that it is resistant to forces such as shock waves, heat waves, vibration forces, tremors, etc., of the same states and grades. For example, if one person had attacked using a low-tier black-grade combat technique, which had only been practiced to the first state, and the other person had countered using the another low-tier black-grade technique, which he had also practiced to the first state, the force would counter each other, and neither would gain the upper hand. It would all depend on the strength level and blood circulation or fighting experience of each person to win against the other. But if one of them had practiced the combat technique to the second state, and the other had only practiced theirs to the first state, the outcome would be different, as the individual who had upgraded his technique to the second level would undoubtedly win. Whale wasn't ignorant of the fact, and he would dare say he was the only one who had practiced their combat technique to the second level, but an average cipher didn't have the potential to do that. He placed his pride on his talent. As he is a 3-star talented student, it was the sole reason for his confidence. Also, he had an enormous amount of blood velocity, which circulated his blood with force. When pushed to the limit, his blood circulation had reached a terrifying 50 cycles per minute the last time he checked. That was another reason for his confidence in defeating David. That was why when he felt the energy entering his palm, he had dismissed it, but he could clearly feel a sort of energy reacting to his palm. Suddenly, Whale's face changed. He could feel that his hand, which was clasping at David's, was quickly getting hotter and hotter. With each passing seconds, pa 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 pa, a popping sound was heard and a slight sizzling sound accompanied it. One could see smoke emerging from the clasped hands. Whale felt a terrifying heat wave passing through his metallic hand's defenses, attempting to burn through his hands, vessels, and blood. His face changed as he attempted to pull back his arm, but it was to no avail. It was as if his hand had been locked by an iron vise. Subsequently, he immediately recognized the technique David had used, Scorching Fury. He couldn't help but be surprised and furious. It was a high-tier black-grade technique. He hadn't expected his opponent to have the boldness to practice a high-tier technique. Practicing a top-tier combat technique will undoubtedly make one powerfully among one's peers, but it was impossible to reach the first state without at least a week of practice just to reach the first state. Following that, to reach the second state, one would need at least 2 to 3 weeks of practice to touch upon the second state. The problem was that there was not enough time to practice such technique. The students were already at each other's throats, and the weak would be trampled upon by the strong, also having their gyno points and resources snatched from each other. No one was stupid enough to give you time or the chance to grow stronger. It was the typical law of the jungle in here. The only difference is that the law of the jungle also has its own rules. The crowds instantly exploded into discussions. They couldn't understand what was happening. Were they not supposed to hear the crunching sounds of bones as expected? But why was there the sound of something popping and frying? And what was with the slightly aromatic smoke of iron and meat emerging from their hands? Janine's expression had since turned ugly. This fellow is really useless. Here he was bragging about how talented he is, reaching the second state of his technique. But what happened now? He was about to get his ass handed to him. His value immediately dropped more than half in Janine's mind. At a particular position on the field, Phillida was sitting on the field with some of her clansmates who had been assigned to this lecture with her. She was slightly surprised by what she saw, but she thought it was to be expected. SJE had figured that there had to be something special about him, since she had been assigned to secretly keep an eye on him, and even before she had been told to, she had been interested in him even before that. She gazed at him with a deep look while she contemplated. Nihia also glanced at David, as he thought, if he couldn't even resolve this little problem by himself 55, then he isn't qualified to be a threat to me. But his normally gentle and easy-to-bully expression was nowhere to be found. Instead, it was replaced by an indifferent look. A bit contrast to what one would expect. The crowds contemplated as they stared at David's smiling face, and the twisted expression whale was slowing surfacing. A guess gradually took form in their mind. Some people still couldn't comprehend what was happening. It was then, "Oh, I see something interesting going on here." A loud, dull but sweet voice rang out from the crowds. The crowds hurriedly parted ways as a curvy figure of a 5 foot 7 inches tall lady emerged. It was Instructor Aella. It was unknown when she had arrived, but she had somehow arrived at the midst of the squabbles. The students quickly arranged themselves in a straight line, not daring to delay. David reluctantly released his opponent's hands. He sighed to himself. It was such a pity. This was a rare chance to test out the strength of his fellow students, and also a chance to hint at them that he was a tough nut to crack. He wasn't as easy to bully as he looked just because his expression looked lazy. Whale hurriedly retracted his hands. The burning sensation was already becoming unbearable for him, and if the situation continued for a little while longer, his metallic palm would be thoroughly broken, which might lead to his hands becoming crippled. His face twitched in fear as he retreated from David with terror. He didn't want to stay a single second with this deceptive person. He looked quite lazy and easy to bully, but who knew he was actually acting a wolf clothed in sheep's wool? Looking down at his hands, it was already disfigured. Some parts are red in color, while some parts are black, and some parts looked as though they had been burnt. The lines segmenting the palms, which is usually deeply imprinted in everyone's palm, had already been burnt clean. His palm was as bald as his head. Absolutely no difference. Seeing as the students had gotten into position, Instructor Arella smiled cheerfully. Her smile was just as radiant as the sun itself. This came as a surprise to the students and also David. Ever since the students could remember, the instructor had never once smiled at them, since she was always so indifferent in any situation. It appears that something bad might happen very soon. And as if confirming their thoughts, Instructor Arella spoke up. "I was about to take you guys on some combat lessons, getting to familiarize you on how to deal with different situations using myriads of tactics." But she paused as her smile widened, gazing at both David and Whale. "I think most of you find that boring, isn't it?" she questioned, and without waiting for them to answer, she continued. "So, since most of you find it very boring, well, don't we take things to a more practical level?" She clapped her hands. "Now let's spar." Saying this, she brought forth her holographic image to the air as she typed in some information into her system. No need to waste my time. Your opponent has been randomly chosen by my AI and would be sent to you in 3, 2, 1 now. As soon as she finished her words, every student in the field got a notification. David also got one. Opening up his system, he saw a new message stating, "Sparring match. Your instructor has initiated a sparring match. Reward for winning, 20 points. Rewards for losing, -5 points. Opponent, Daisy Vega. Tally, number 16. Time, 5 minutes." The information was as simple as that. There was nothing else about his opponent he could take advantage of. And according to his understanding, it seemed that they would be the 16th group to fight. David frowned at the lack of information, but was also somewhat relieved. If he couldn't view the full information on someone, then that means that others would be unable to gain access to his ether. It was both comforting and frustrating. There wasn't even a picture of the girl he was to spar with. The only way he would know was when the time comes for them to step forwards. She would undoubtedly do so. Retracting his thoughts. "What number were you given?" Nihio whispered to him. 16 you, he answered in a low voice. "It's a little early than mine. Mine is 22. Nihia answered in a low tone filled with a silly smugness. But David just glanced at him, after which he didn't say any more. It was unknown what he was thinking about. Instructor Ella instantly took off to a particular position on the field. Suddenly, the instructor suppressed a groan slightly as a bone blade gradually grew from her forearm, just like X-Men. David watched in mild surprise and the other students as the bone took form, growing into a 1-meter bone blade. David had thought it was an illusion when he had first seen the bone blade during their initiation process, but now it seems as though it was real. Then the instructor used the bone blade in drawing a 10 meters radius circle in the middle of the field, indicating it was their sparring field. As the students were still stunned and awed by her display of power, Instructor Ella grew a bit smug and angry. "No need to mindlessly waste my time, people. Tammy, Emma, you're up. Hurry up," she hastily called them. 2 female students quickly walked up to the ring that had been drawn by the instructor. One of the girls, Tammy, is a blonde girl with sharp eyes that radiated a certain amount of confidence. She was a bit curvy and also quite beautiful compared to her opponent. At first glance, Emma appeared quite short. She has an average face, but her hair color was pink. One might doubt whether she had dyed it, but it appears she was born with it. As the two settled on the stage, the instructor wasted no time and immediately shouted, "Start." But what was surprising was that neither of them made their move yet. Instead, both of them stood opposite each other, observing themselves. Tammy stood arrogantly, with a slight elegance in her posture, looking down on her opponent. Opposite her, Emma stood in a battle stance, not daring to underestimate the one before her. She had heard about Tammy's deed. Tammy had forced the individual who was currently at the 9th position. And although she hadn't won, she only lost by a few moves, which proves her competence. After a few seconds passed, Emma seemed to have lost her patience, and without warning, she rushed up towards Tammy and launched a spinning kick towards her head. The air whizzed by the force of the attack. It was clear that if the attack had landed on someone, it would have at least break a few bones. But the attack had hit nothing but air. Tammy's body swayed lightly like the leaf of a willow tree as she evaded the deadly kick that was heading towards her head, showing she had learned a type of footwork technique since she easily evaded the attack. Emma wasn't at all disappointed, though. She didn't have any hopes of taking Tammy out on the first attack. And if that really happened, she would count that as her luck. She was only testing the waters. It was normal courtesy to test each other's strength before getting serious. That was what Emma thought, but as she was about to pursue her opponent to keep her momentum steady, her eyes caught a fist that was sent hurling towards her face, accompanied with the faint sound of an engine rumbling from a distance, emerging from the fist. 9 Revolution Fist. A fist technique which taps into the power points in the bloodstream, revolving the blood located in the blood vessels, veins, and meridians 9 times, and also increasing the force in the fist 9 times. The fist technique was originally a red grade technique, as it is only a red grade level technique that can increase one's power by that much. But the Institute split the technique into 3, namely 3 Revolution Fist, 6 Revolution Fist, and finally 9-revolution fist. 3 revolutions fist had been simplified by the professors in the institute into a black grade technique. But if you thought it would increase your strength by 3 times, then you are in for a big disappointment. The 3 revolutions fist only increases the attack force by half, and only if you practice it to the perfection state would you be able to unleash twice the strength contained in your fist. Emma's face changed slightly. Her opponent had used a combat technique. She hadn't expected her opponent to utilize a combat technique only a few seconds starting the match. She was hoping they would test the waters first, testing the limits of their powers before delivering the final and killing blow. It's obvious what Tammy was trying to do. Tammy wanted to end the match as quickly as she could, and from this, one could infer that she is more impatient than Emma was. Circulating her blood technique and activating her combat skill, Emma could hear the joyful slouching of blood flowing through her veins, faintly resounding in her body and with her heartbeat propelling like an engine. Suddenly, she also threw her own punch, fist against fist. Swoosh! Emma's fist was soft but surprisingly fast. But as the 2 fists was about to collide, whiplash! Emma's arm unexpectedly grew soft, almost boneless. In a flash, she swiftly wrapped her arm around Tammy's incoming fist like a vine or a snake entangling a stick, holding onto them strong and resilient. Whiplash! A technique which softened the bones to an unbelievable degree, making them soft and resilient. The force behind Tammy's fist instantly slowed down immediately. Not wasting any time, Emma drew Tammy towards her. Surprised, she stumbled forwards unexpectedly. Tammy's face turned dark in that moment. She had thought that the fight would be an easy win for her, but unexpectedly, she had been placed at an absolute disadvantage. It was absolutely infuriating. Her face grew red as she turned angry. Without evading it, she moved towards Emma as though she was in her trap, and then, boom, and headbutt. She had headbutted Emma unexpectedly in her moment of anger. On normal circumstances, she would have never done that, as she considered herself above such low tactics, but her anger had gotten the best of her. Emma stumbled back in shock. Her head was dizzy as she was unable to comprehend what was happening. A little bit of blood flowed down her tiny nose. Not waiting the slightest for Emma to recover, Tammy stepped forwards and proceeded to knock her out cold with a single punch. David raised his eyebrows in surprise. He hadn't been expecting this outcome, and neither did anyone. But this was also a lesson to him, as he told himself that be more cautious. There were different types of technique in the institute, so he told himself to be extra cautious. Instructor Arella glanced at Tammy with a wired look as she said, "Good, perfect. During your spar, I hope you are able to utilize every single bit of power and advantages you can possibly get." After saying that, she called out to the next people that had been selected to spar. But not after placing Emma's knocked-out body in another part of the field. 2 male youths came out this time. Both were incredibly handsome, as though they were models. One was Latino with a white punk hairstyle, while the other looked French, but he was a bit more handsome than the former with a black and heavily gelled hair that shone with the sun. The bright, cool sun shone softly through the wide field, creating an illusion of the field filled with golden greenish grass, instead of the normal green grass. Groups of students went up to the ring in twos, and after a few minutes of sparring, only one would come down unscathed. Sometimes, both students that had gone up the ring would, or might up unharmed, but that was only due to the winner's overwhelming victory or mercy. There were a few students who were quite merciless and cruel, and without the slightest bit of hesitation. They leave their fellow students with something they can remember them with: broken bones. Although the instructor hadn't said anything regarding rules, the students were all aware that there are limits to their actions. They didn't dare to cripple their fellow students, talk less of severely injuring them. The least the students could do was to break a few bones. With enough treatment, it would heal in a few days or at most a month. The punishments given by the Institute to those who didn't abide by the rules proves to be very severe. The Institute appears to be very serious about their rules. It was like a national anthem of the Institute. David and the other students watched as various display of techniques are put into use. Some performed well, while some were just there to get beaten. This gave David the opportunity to gauge the level of his combat strength and ability amongst his fellow students. Although it isn't very accurate, but he could say with confidence that very few had the ability to resist his combo of scorching fury and threefold step. With his ability to control every part of his body as he wished, he could easily influence every part of his body according to what was written on the manual. In a few minutes of practice, he could easily master any technique he wished to. That was the reason why he could master a red grade technique, which was even very difficult for a professor to practice even to the prosaic state. Only the Grand Professor, who has the highest strength and authority in the Institute, could easily practice a red grade technique, because the stronger one becomes, the more control they would have over their body, muscles, and even blood. With the Grand Professor's strength, he long since has the ability to control every part of his body. Although it might appear to be quite difficult, the fact was that he could do it. There was a theory that had gone around the world of the Generic Association. Word had gotten out that if one was strong enough, one could control even the very genes that made up his or her existence. Controlling the genes. One might take the sentence lightly if one wasn't a genetic engineer or a spryer. If one dared to say this world outside, just as lightly, 9NE would incur the wrath of all the spryers in the world. Even the powerhouses wouldn't fail to join in. Controlling the genes, in simple terms, means turning into a demigod. With the ability to control one's genes, one could basically rearrange the genes and DNA in the body, easily genetically rearranging and editing the genes, which means one could acquire basically any ability as long as one has the genetic codes. An owl with a night vision or a bat with the ability to see at night is made up of additional genetic codes, which means if one could read the genetic codes which made up the ability, one could rearrange the genetic codes in his eyes to also obtain the same ability temporarily or permanently. Analyzing the genetic codes of animals and beasts could be done using the genetic gadgets produced by the Generic Association, which is made up of the geniuses who had gotten together around the globe. Although David was aware of how terrifying his ability is, he was still very ignorant about the fact that his ability was one which every professor wished to acquire, but can only slowly accumulate. The level of influence and control he has over his body is almost equal to that of a Grand Professor's. David wasn't aware of this. If he was well aware of his situation, he wouldn't dare to perform threefold step in public or in private, even if his life is at stake. As that is basically saying, although I don't have much talent, I have a few secrets on, or in me. It would basically mean his capture. There are literally eyes and ears everywhere in that institution, the cybergenic life forms. If you read Chapter 13, one mistake, and everything would be revealed. And once revealed, the Institute wouldn't even bat an eye as they would capture him, excited to open him up, experiment on him, and also read his genetic codes which gave him the ability, in order to replicate such ability. By then, he wouldn't be able to die even if he desperately wished to. He wouldn't have the ability to decide his fate. He could only watch as he was being dissected and operated on. His fate after being reincarnated. If the Institute was successful in its experiment and could replicate David's ability, he would be hailed as the savior of humanity. But by then, no one knows if he would be dead or alive. If every spryer in the Institute was equipped with such terrifying ability, they can easily learn a red grade technique as if it was a low-tier black grade technique in a short amount of time. Increasing the blood circulation wouldn't be a problem anymore, and in time, the REBs wouldn't be a problem in a few years. In at least 2 to 5 years. Ignorant of his situation, David watched as 2 other students walked towards the ring. One was a male student with pretty decent features, a handsome face, straight nose, pretty thin lip, and a greasily but pretty curly hair. Isn't that Khalifa Drake? A student mumbled in astonishment. His friend, who was beside him, also appeared quite surprised. You are right. He is Khalifa Drake, the one who is currently holding the 5th place in the ranking. Didn't they say he had hurriedly paid some weak student 100 gyno points in order to keep his position? another student said in disdain. You look quite smart, but who would have thought that you were so ignorant? The first student insulted. You. Pointing his finger in anger, he was about to retort, but wasn't given a chance to. What you? Think about it. If you had the amount of gyno points he was given, wouldn't you buy a few serums and other things with no expense to quickly increase your strength? With a roll of his eyes, the other students cut off. That is quite true, since he is smart enough to think about paying someone to force a duel with him. I'm certain he could very well think of this too. Another agreed. Listening on, David then glanced at the lady who was also going up to the ring, but his expression turned serious in that moment. It was Phillida. Phillida walked quite elegantly towards the ring. She is one you could call the epitome of beauty, an ebony skin beauty, a perfection in itself. There isn't such a thing as racism in this world. Who would have time for that when the world was still hanging by a thread? The REBs are threatening humanity, and you still have the time and energy to discriminate against one's race. Are you mad? It seems like something is wrong with your brain. If others were to find out, he or she would be severely cut off from the world. If a race was to evolve the first and fastest after the REBs, it would be the race with the least amount of enhancements done to its body. Only those who are blank can have their genetic codes rewritten. Only a blank paper can something useful be written or drawn on. Phillida wore a blue short dress which hugged her upper body, showing off her bountiful figure that was tempting to burst out and a long blue leggings that popped up her perfectly shaped behind. It was quite the distraction. If one were to compare who was more beautiful between her and instructor Ella, one would be at a loss for words. Both are quite the beauty. Phillida the temptress walked and then settled on the ring while waiting for the instructor's signal to start. David watched with a serious gaze as if his life depended on him. At the beginning, when they had both met, it would be an overstatement to say that he wasn't the least but interested in her. He would be lying if he said he didn't wish to get closer to her, who wouldn't be. But although his brain wanted to, his body wouldn't respond to him. Also, he could faintly sense if one was a threat to him, and according to his bodily instincts, her threat level had already reached a terrifying state. David had once thought with his ability now, there were a few students who he couldn't deal with, but as he came close to the few of his fellow students, he realized that he was completely wrong. Although he felt quite threatened because of a few students and their number counts went up to 10. But there were about 900 new students in the institute, David included. There are only 50 students here attending the combat lessons, which means that the students had been divided into various segments in and assigned to various classes. Therefore, by calculation, if 5 people were of threats to David in each of the 18-plus segments, amongst the 900-plus students, there might be around 90-plus strong students in the institute, which could easily crush David. It was only a rough calculation, though. David wasn't all that serious about it. He wasn't going to discourage himself. If given enough time, he was confident in surpassing most of them if he was diligent enough. Calming his mindset, he settled down and calmly observed the fight which was about to take place. Start. Khalif didn't move to start. He stood stably and stared at Phillida with a feverish but restrained look. It appears that he knew how to hold himself back and is quite smart. With a slight smirk, he spoke up. If I may speak freely, you are quite a rare beauty. But it's a pity I would have to mess you up in this round. I apologize in advance. Although you are more tempting than the credits, but I wish to pass, I apologize once more. Just like a man of manners, he apologized beforehand. Phillida gazed indifferently at Khalif as she spoke coldly. Stop your nonsense and make your move. Not giving him the slight, but a face. Khalif's face dropped for a sec before he composed himself. As you W-dash, he didn't even complete his sentence when he suddenly disappeared from his location. Bang! All that was left was slightly deep footprint. He had shot forwards with terrifying speed, as if he was a phantom. Phantom daze, a technique that allows one to burst out with terrifying speed or strength in an unexpected but swift manner. In less than 2 blinks of an eye, he had appeared before Phillida, and abruptly, he swung his arms towards her like a sledgehammer as his fists crackled crazily like thunder. Hammer strike, hammer bash. He had reached the second state already and almost close to the third state. smashing his fists towards Phillida like a crazy ape trying to beat down his foes. Boom! Boom! Two muffled sounds rang out simultaneously, almost like the sound of a hammer heavily hitting a soft and hard sofa. Khalif's eyes popped wide open in disbelief. He gazed and saw two long and slender arms holding onto his own. If it were in a different situation, one might think it quite romantic, and Khalif couldn't happy if the situation was slot different. But this situation was a mystery to him. At the last moment, Phillida had stopped his fist attack technique, which contains several thousand kilograms of force contained within. Without waiting for him to snap out of his surprise, Phillida held tightly onto the wrist, and with a slight twist of her waist, she tossed his body to the ground, intending to knock him down. But Khalif wasn't smart for nothing. Every spryher is more flexible than average human. It seems Phillida had forgotten. With a little maneuvering, Khalif landed on his feet, unstable. Upon seeing this, she immediately took action. Like a dancing butterfly, she rushed towards Khalif while he was still unstable. Arriving before him, she suddenly flicked her index and middle fingers simultaneously, as if she was dusting a bit of dirt off her hands. Boom! Khalif's body shook widely as though he had been struck by lightning. Even though he blocked the attack with a hurriedly put-out hammer strike, he had still been affected. With a kick, he was sent flying like a soccer ball off the ring, landing heavily to the ground. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't even lift a single finger. He had been paralyzed thoroughly. The butterfly's flick, 2 fingers. Second state of the technique. A black grade technique. For those of you who are unaware about the grade of techniques, from lowest to the highest. Black, brown, red. LOL, sorry. I only reveal this much, otherwise it'd be a spoiler. Thanks for reading and your support. The butterfly's flick, double flick. This signifies having reached the second state of the black grade technique. Having seen this, it is safe if one assumes that she is a genius, but that is not necessarily true. Although she is a genius, there is not a single genius in the Institute who would learn a black grade technique to the second state in such a short amount of time. It was basically impossible, but there were exceptions to that. There are a lot of families in the sector who are knowledgeable about the ways of the Institute. And there are also some families that have their own people graduate from the Institute. They have also had their fair share of geniuses. Once these geniuses become powerhouses, they were expected to drop a few techniques to the family for the sake of the younger generation. But it was impossible to do so, since the Institute would never allow their techniques to be taken away, much less taken away. It was the product of their predecessors' past experiences, experiments, and excavation. It was their sweat and blood. Precious secret resources. They would never allow them to be taken away. But those techniques could be simplified thoroughly that even an ordinary person would be able to practice them. And then with a few gyno points, they could be sent to the family for the younger generations to learn in their few younger years and master in preparation to entering the Institute. For example, the family Phillida came from the Gold family. The Gold family has seen a few years of prosperity since their family had given birth to a few geniuses who had proudly graduated from the Institute and turned into strong individuals over the years. Which means the Gold family would undoubtedly own a few simplified versions of techniques. There was a time the Gold family had produced a very strong individual, and it was unsurprisingly a woman. The lady had then chosen to simplify a black grade technique, since she was a 4-star talented student. It was a bit easier for her to learn the technique in a bit over half a year, but that was owing to the fact that she had been chosen as an assistant instructor, so she could safely practice without fear. No students would dare offend her. She had a bit of time on her hands. She was the one who had simplified the butterfly's flick and had submitted it to the Institute. Ever since Phillida could remember, she had been practicing the technique since forever. It had become a part of her already, as it was almost instincts to her. It was also the technique she had executed during their initiation, if one looked into it. So when she had gotten admitted into the Institute, with no hesitation at all, she picked up the butterfly's flick reel technique and had practiced with it. And in just a few days, she had reached the second state of the technique, which was terrifying in itself. But if the Gold family had thought of this method to produce strong geniuses, The idea had obviously come from somewhere. And the Gold family was obviously not the first family to have such mindset. This mindset had become a trait in the families residing in Sector 99 as they had the resources to do so. The rest of the families in other sector, according to what was shown to the public, they do not have the resources to support such things. Therefore, it was obvious that Phillida wasn't the only one to have practiced a black grade technique. There might even be more terrifying geniuses who might have surpassed her, but it was unknown. Meanwhile, the students gaped in admiration as they stared at Phillida. "Isn't that the butterfly's flick?" An Asian female student blurted out in pure disbelief. Right? I remember now. You are absolutely correct. But isn't that a black grade technique? A student said in a confused tone, obviously finding it hard to believe. Black grade technique? If that was a black grade technique, then I'm a spy sent from other worlds. Another student retorted in scorn, refusing to believe a single word of it. But it's true. It's even in the second state. The double flick, the Asian student argued back. As if, the other student scoffed. It was still a bit unbelievable when you said it was a black grade technique. But now, you are still claiming it's in the second state. Do you take me for a fool? Thus, an argument ensued. Some had recognized the techniques when they had been trying to select theirs, and some had marked it down, intending on practicing them when they were strong enough, but who would have thought that someone had already practiced it to the second state already? They had still been struggling to reach the second states of their black grade technique, but someone had already reached the second state of a brown grade technique. It was unbelievable and unacceptable. It made them feel worthless and useless. David squinted his eyes as his eyebrows furrowed. He didn't know what was going on, and from his experience and any rumors he had heard, it was impossible to practice a black grade technique without a few months of practice, making your body get used to such movements, ways, and paths. As far as I know, it is basically impossible to achieve such speed. So what is going on here? David muttered to himself with a confused expression. Seeing his pondering face, Nihia attempted to clear his confusion for him. She had probably been practicing the simplified version of the technique since she was a kid, he said dismissively. But he suddenly stopped as he gazed at David with a serious but confused look, and he asked, "Why do you not know this?" Nihia's gaze was serious. It was the first time he was showing such expression in public. It was also David's first time seeing his true expression. Without waiting for David to reply, he continued, "Although you don't like reading, but it is something you experience yourself, or repeatedly told by the else in your family. If you are still ignorant about that fact, it means you might have lost your memory, or you're simply not from the top 5 sector." Nihia's frown deepened while he pondered. "So why do I feel such threats off you?" Confused, Nihia muttered in a low voice. Glancing at him, "I don't remember telling you that I am from any of the top 5 sectors in the Federation." David stated dismissively. "Why? Is something wrong?" He faced Nihia with a piercing gaze. Nihia had an uncertain expression, but then he relaxed as he smiled. "No, it's nothing serious. It's just that this information is made available only to those families originating from the top 5 sectors." David glanced at him for a moment before retracting his gaze. There wasn't any surprise or suspense in the next few matches. It was normal, and only the different techniques being used made it interesting. David was suddenly startled. That was because a notification had popped up in his head, a sound which only he could hear. He was next. Ignoring the gazes from the crowds, David walked into the ring. His opponent was already there, waiting for him. A beautiful girl with chubby cheeks, cute face with an innocent look that makes one want to squeeze them in happiness. It was just too cute. Although her body wasn't in the perfect curve, it was still sensual. Her bright black eyes with her black curly hair that screamed 0. But David wasn't deceived by her appearance at all. He was certain not to underestimate her. It was inevitable that the rankings this week wasn't accurate at all. The students are well aware of this fact, which was why there hadn't been much conflicts amongst the students. A random student whose looks might seem funny and personality is one that doesn't take things seriously might just be strong enough to compete for the first place in the ranking. The smart ones remained low-key, but the smarter ones made friends with almost everyone, as no one knows who is who. There wasn't anyone to blame other than the Institute. But finding fault with the Institute over such matter is as ineffective as punching the air. It's a wasted effort. The Institute had suddenly published the rankings much earlier than it was scheduled to, startling the students badly. Many of the new students had hoped themselves up in their room to practice their manuals and techniques for the rankings they had thought would be released to the public. But who would have known it would come up much earlier? As David thought about it, he was firm on his resolve that no one was to be underestimated right now unless their strength had been thoroughly revealed. It would be best to remain cautious and calm. Adjusting his stance, he immediately brought himself to his top state. He circulated his blood, increasing its velocity, and it swished like a water tap along his veins to every part of his body. Strength began to fill his body in a fast pace along with the increase in his heartbeat. In less than a few seconds, his blood revolved like lightning in his system. The force he used to propel his blood was only 70% of his power. Every Spryer has the ability to regulate their blood velocity. It is like an innate ability gained the moment they had been turned. David chose to revolve 70% of his cycle, as he doesn't want to reveal his true strength yet. It would be a nice surprise to his opponent once he burst out with his full strength. In the next second, he immediately heard a soft shout, "Start!" Not wasting a single second, David punched out with force, without the slightest bit of technique. The ripped as the fist tore through the wind, swinging towards the young lady who seemed to be scared witless. Daisy stood in her position like a statue, as though she couldn't move due to the fear of the force coming with the fist. But surprisingly, she raised her palm as she countered the fist with her palm. "Pa! Pust!" The astonishing sound that one had expected didn't come out. Instead, it was the sound of flesh being slapped. David's face didn't change. It was as though he had expected something like that would happen. Every new student by now already owned an attribute, trait, or a calling card that they could call their OWN.SO. This wasn't much of a surprise to him. David only felt his punch hitting something very soft as his fist almost sank in her palm. There was even a slight force attempting to pull him forwards. It wasn't the feedback he had been expecting. It was as if he had punched a bunch of stacked cotton. It was extremely uncomfortable as he had to and forcibly pull his strength back so as to not get dragged by the suction force forwards. Upon closer inspection, Daisy's chubby body rippled, as they seemed to be redistributing and redirecting the force invading them. At the same time, creating a suction force to pull honor of the invading force. As he didn't use his full strength yet, it was quite easy for him to break free of the situation, and also, he had been cautious. With a slight flex of his hand, he easily broke free. He retreated back a few steps as he gazed at his opponent. Daisy was slightly surprised. Although it looked like she had taken the fist easily, the strength that had entered her body almost broke apart her flesh. If it weren't for the fact that she had just entered the second state of her technique, a piece of her flesh would definitely burst, unable to contain such strength. But she had no need to fear, although there are geniuses like Phillida who had high talents. There only do few. There are even some students who hadn't even reached the prosaic state, the beginning state. Yet, they're still stuck at practicing the techniques they had chosen. It might probably be due to the fact that the technique doesn't suit their personalities or some other reason entirely, like the talents. However, there are still a few students who have reached the second state, but they aren't much anyways. Calculating the facts, Daisy guessed that the probability that David had practiced his technique to the second level was slim. Therefore, she only giggled cutely when she saw his actions, not really taking him serious. The only thing she was wary about was his strength, and she guessed that he had practiced his training manual more diligently than he had with his combat technique, which was quite smart to her. But she shook her head in her mind as she thought, "It is a pity he had met me. My technique specifically counters strength." Although she mourned for him, it disappeared in a flash. "Come on, little guy. I know you can do better than that." She placed her hands on her waist and cheered him on with a huge smile on her face. The surrounding audiences laughed slightly at the funny sight. At a position in lines of the students, Nihia could be seen frowning to himself, while gazing at David intently and also muttering something under his breath. Phillida smirked as she nodded her head in confirmation. She had already confirmed her suspicions of him. He was quite weak, as she had predicted. She was also quite sure that he wouldn't even be able to withstand a single finger flick from her, not to mention the second state of the butterfly's flick, the double flick. Seeing the audience laughing with him as the main subject, David was a bit flustered. He wasn't one who liked being the center of attention. And although he wasn't antisocial, he wasn't very bold either. He couldn't even remember when last he had gone to a stage. And now, with the crowds publicly laughing at his expense, David got a bit flustered. But with the level of control he had over his body, such stage fright was easy to curb. He managed to control his emotions in just a few breaths. Not saying anything, David instantly activated his technique. Scorching Fury, first state, first-degree burn. Although he didn't say anything, he wasn't one to take an insult lying still. He is still a young and passionate young man, and also a hot-blooded youth. Without the slightest bit of hesitation, his muscles quivered as they oscillated at a particular frequency. The friction produced gave rise to heat, and the velocity of his blood flowing in a particular part of his arms expanded the temperature in his fists by a huge degree. He instantly blasted the high-tier black grade technique towards her laughing face. He didn't believe her face wouldn't cave in due to the force behind fist. Heat spread through his veins, and the temperature in the air increased noticeably. Whoosh! Daisy smirked slightly. She had expected this since she taunted him purposely. She wished to end the fight early, and more importantly, she wanted to see his trump card. Raising her palm again, she accepted the fist her palm once again. Bam! Crack! Fist and palm colliding, Daisy's feet sank a few inches down the field with the force as cracks seems to spread with her as the center. And then, she couldn't help but take a step back. She hadn't expected David's attack to be this strong, enough for her to take another step backwards to direct the force towards a new ground. That was her own technique, redirecting and redistributing forces. When their attacks had collided, this time it sounded like a proper hit. Heat waves spread through the air and then dispersed rapidly, as if they had been forcibly dispersed. Her face had long since turned serious while she thought. David didn't give her enough time to ponder. He instantly blasted another scorching fury towards Daisy fiercely. Bam! 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 David kept punching with scorching fury towards her, and Daisy kept taking a few steps back, one at a time. Soon, she was very close to reaching the ring line drawn by the instructor. She was as well aware that the moment she crossed the line, it signifies that she had lost the spar. Also, her points would surely be deducted. Damn! Daisy's gaze grew dark as she panicked slightly. Then, without warning, she stamped her feet towards the ground. She stabilized herself, and with a low shout. Rebounding force. Her vascular muscles quivered, and veins suddenly popped up from her arm with sheer power. She had accumulated enough power in her. In the next instance, and with an unprecedented speed, she released all the power in her with full force. She had used this technique many times to turn back a bad situation, and it had never failed her. Not yet, at least. She instantly hurled the deadly palm at David's chest. The air gave way as the wind screeched with the force. A normal spryher would be too late to react and would only watch as the palm hit them. David's face immediately changed slightly. The power within those palms would most likely kill, if not injure a normal human, but thankfully, he wasn't. And without hesitation, he stomped his foot as propelled his blood velocity along his vessels to its limits. Raw strength filled his body as his second heart kept pumping dark blood liquid into his system. That wasn't all. He also activated the second state of his technique. Second-degree burn. That's right, he also had the time to execute his own technique. Heat engulfed the area of his hands as the surroundings distorted from the heat. As blood-red veins covered a great length of his arms, squirming and quivering like worms. It was a terrifying sight. With a great measure of strength, David punched out with full force. Bang! David felt a horrific amount of force poured into him. His body quivered as if it had been hit by a train. He was badly shaken by the impact, taking 4 steps backward to negate the force. for a deep footprint could be seen on the field as the grass had been crushed long ago. Veins covered his body as his eyes appeared quite bloodshot. Blood rushed into his head and his face was flushed red. It was a sign of one losing control of one's blood cycle. His circulation was disrupted by the force, leading to him needing a few seconds to gather his blood and then propelling them forwards. But in a battle, a few seconds of paralysis was not much different than losing on the good side but on the downside. It was no different than death. Meanwhile, Daisy's palm rammed at David's. She was stopped dead at her tracks in action. Disbelief filled her face, as did she couldn't believe what was happening. David's condition could be said to be serious, and likewise be taken lightly, as he could forcibly control his blood if he wanted to. With the level of control he had over his body and blood, such situation was as simple as flipping a coin. It wouldn't require much effort, but if he did that, it was no different than laying his cards bare for other to read, that he wouldn't do that. Instead, he chose to wait for his body to recover naturally, but it would take at least 3 to 5 seconds to gather. But that was enough time for his opponent to pummel him. But to his surprise, the counterattack he had been waiting for didn't come. He looks upwards only to realize that his opponent was on the ground, unconscious. It seems that the attack she had just performed was a double-edged sword. It increases her strength amount to a terrifying degree, but then she had to pay for it. David heaved a sigh of relief. He thought he was about to lose. If she had come at him that moment, he was definitely going to lose. He gathered himself and walked back towards his position in his line, as the instructor had called his win on the match and had taken the unconscious girl and laid her down together with the other unconscious students. David's eyes shone as he took in a deep breath. It was the first time he tested out his strength amidst his peers. He couldn't help but think it satisfying. His thoughts were momentarily disrupted by the instructor. Nihia in Mex. The instructor spoke loudly. David watched as Nihia walked towards the ring with steady and soft steps. Murmurs involuntarily entered his ears. Mex? Is it the same Mex? Someone asked in confusion. You mean Mex Rawl? The one ranked 5th in the current rankings list? Another student asked dubiously. The students nodded their heads in confirmation. One then suddenly spoke up. Then, that student should be done for. Yeah, I agree with you. Since he is still able to keep the position, he is definitely very strong. The student beside him spoke up suddenly. That other student is definitely done for. I wager he wouldn't last 5 moves from him, someone whispered. David didn't mind the murmurs. Instead, he focused his attention on the fight that was about to take place. Weirdly enough, Nihia had a confident expression on his face as he stood opposite his opponent. But his opponent had an even more ferocious and arrogant expression on his face as he gazed at Nihia with an indifferent expression. The instructor has long since grown tired. She tapped at her holographic projection and the record of her voice played out. Start. Contrary to one's expectations, none of them took the initiative to attack, and it seemed as if it was beneath them to do so. A minute passed, but both of them stood still without the slightest intent on attacking. The time continued to tick, and soon 2 minutes had passed, but still both figures stood motionlessly at the field as though they were there to take a breath of fresh air, not at all concerned. Although the instructor hadn't said anything about there being no winners, it was known to everyone that should the match end as a draw, both students would have their credits deducted. After what seemed like forever, Mech's expression turned slightly. It was almost a minute to the end of their spar, meaning 4 minutes had almost passed, but as he looked at the face of his opponent, it looked quite relaxed, as though the loss in credits wasn't that big of a deal. But to him, he couldn't afford such losses. 5 credits was of huge significance to him, not to mention the 20 credits he would gain if he won the match. Therefore, he grew impatient inside, but then he suddenly smiled. It's quite surprising. I've never thought you were quite the tolerant type. Mex glanced at Nihia. As Nihia was about to open his mouth to reply, his eyes suddenly flashed as his figure faded. Not even half of a second had passed. Another figure occupied the spot along with a cruel and fierce wind accompanied by a hair-raising fist. Mex had taken the initiative. He wants to be able to graduate or get chosen by a professor. Having a few points deducted from his current accumulations of credits would badly destroy his plans. He wasn't going to allow that. Now, all he needed to do was end the match in the next 40 seconds. Instantly, he pursued Nihia's figure, dishing out fist after fist with terrifying force. The two figures were like shadows, flashing in and out of existence on the field, stirring up the winds. Ordinary students were unable to figure out their current location. They could only gape in astonishment. David's eyes narrowed into thin slits as he squinted. If it wasn't for his body instincts, telling or more like warning him about Nihia, he would have been too surprised to say anything. Whoosh! The speed at which the two figures were moving were inconceivable. David figured he would only surpass their speed if he used twofold steps. He can regulate the amount of strength he chose to deliver. So instead of using threefold steps to triple his speed, he figured doubling his speed would suffice, hence twofold steps. Fist after fist whirled through the air as terrifying shockwaves could be felt. Their movement speed were simply terrifying, and no one knows if they were utilizing a movement technique, but it was highly likely. Mech's face grew increasingly dark. According to his calculations, it would take more than 40 seconds before he could catch up to Nihia's figure. He didn't have time for that. His fire suddenly stopped, and his smile grew sinister. "You are truly good, but these ends here you force my hands," he suddenly shouted. Shadow eclipse. Swoosh! Nihia's face changed as he twisted his head sideways. A sharp palm blade suddenly swept past his face, drawing a thin line of blade down his ears. Mech's figure had somehow emerged behind him. Again, another palm sliced through the air, slicing the air apart with a screech as Nihia forcibly twisted his shoulder to evade the terrifying amount of force. Suddenly, Nihia's face grew savage. His wrinkled a bit as if he had gotten a few years older. His hair grew by a few centimeters, but only the hair in his eyebrows were visible, with a low growl escaping his lips. If one had a sharp eyesight, one would see, as his fingernails grew a few centimeters long, curved and sharp, his body growing a few centimeters tall, his shoulders got broader. Wolf King's curse. All of this changes happened in almost half a second. With a blast. Bang! The ground caved in, and with amazing speed, Nihia's body flashed, escaping the mech's attacks. And before anyone could notice, a claw slashed through the air in a blink of an eye. Alpha's claw. Whoosh! A figure screamed suddenly and unexpectedly. The figure was sent flying through the air as it zoomed out of the ring like a cannonball. Bam, bam, bam. The figure's momentum stopped, and everyone could see who it was. It was Mex. His body laid flatly on the floor along with the skid mark it made. His face etched in horror as he watched blood pump out of his body. For bloody claw marks was visible through the torn cloth he wore, as blood gushed out through the holes like a rushing tap water. He was rapidly losing blood, and in a few seconds, it was quite possible he would die from the blood loss. A cipher dying from blood loss, it was the most common type of death back in the day. One of the disadvantages of being a Spryher was the rapid rate of blood loss in the body, as long as one was injured and a major blood vessel had been punctured or cut. Within a few seconds of the injury, the person would be dead before any medical care or fast first aid method could be put to use. The reason for that is because a Spryher in combat is always in an excited state. For a cipher, they had to pump their blood into their system to gain more strength. The faster the cycle, the stronger one would become. A thing everyone knows, which means they experience rapid increase in blood cycle and a fast rate of the heart beating. This process allows the blood to flow rapidly in the body, and if there were any type of puncture that had suddenly emerged, then the blood would gush out from that location like water that had escaped its constraint from a dam. The blood is just like a very fast-flowing and circulating river, and the body is the container, while the heart is just like the engine of an alternator that makes the water circulate in the container. If a puncture is to appear on the container, the contents inside will spill out thereby, depending on the force the engine propels the water at. Which means a Spryher with 60 CPM will experience twice the same amount of blood loss of a Spryher with a 30 CPM. cycle per minute. An example of that is mechs. Currently, the blood hadn't even lessened one bit as it gushed out like a water pump. Suddenly, a figure flashed and suddenly appeared beside the lying Mex, who was watching his blood flow with wide eyes filled with fear. She suddenly used her delicate fingers to hold each cuts together, dyeing her hands with a bloody hue and causing him to grunt loudly in pain. He bit his lips tightly so as to not shout out in pain. Then, with a spray of the container she had in her hands, Instructor Ella carefully sprayed the liquid over the lines and cautiously glued back the wounds. The white spray glue was a type of glue that tightly holds the flesh back together. There was even a legend about it, or more like a rumor, that the flesh glue had even glued pieces of torn organs before. But no one dared experiment to confirm such groundless rumors. After half a minute had passed, she had glued the 4 cuts to perfection. It was as if she had done it a few thousand times before. It was like the injury was never there. The only proof of the injury was the blood splattered all over the floor and the 4 scar lines on Mech's chest and shirt. That's all. Done with that, Instructor Aella turned to face Nihia with a vicious glare shooting outwards. "You won already, so why won't you get off my ring?" she thundered. She was incredibly angry at this moment. If anything happened to the students at this moment, she was the one to take care of it. And since a student was already ninja, she was the one to feel responsibility. But she was reluctant to do so. She had practically squandered a few thousand gyno points on a student. The flesh adhesive is a very important contraption that every Spryher must have, as it could save one's life in a desperate situation. An example of that is MERS. A student saw the instructor's angry expression and couldn't help but feel touched. Their instructor cared a lot about them, but they were sorely mistaken. Instructor Ella never cared about them. They could be dead for she knew, and that wouldn't affect the resources she would receive from the Institute. But having a dead student leaves a pretty bad stain to her reputation, which could allow others the opportunity to target her. She only cared for her resources and the gyno points she had used to bind the flesh adhesive, just in case the students encounter any mishaps. It seemed her intuition was right, but still it pained her to let go. She could return the flesh adhesive and then request a refund. But now that she had used it, it would be impossible now, which was why she was angry. Oh, yes. Coming back to his senses, Nihia got out of the ring. As the other students gazed at him with awe and respect, David watched on casually as Nihia approached at his position, and then he joined his position he was in before amidst the straight line of students beside David. He suddenly leaned over David's ear and whispered, "Boss, I did good, right?" Nodding his head as he yawned twice in a row. "Yeah, outdid good. Didn't expect you to be that strong. Anyway, do you have any idea what time this lecture ends?" He suddenly changed the topic, as if it wasn't all important. Nihia stayed silent. It was obvious he was pondering some things, and then he smirked. "Why? Do you have something urgent you need to do?" "Of course I do have something important to do. I feel a little sleepy, so I need a nap," David said, obviously while glancing at Nihia, as if he is stupid. He obviously wasn't going to sleep. With the battle that had happened just now, he felt the urge to increase his power quickly. It was a bit suffocating, as their prowess was a little beyond what he had speculated. Nihia only rolled his eyes. That guy's simply far too lazy. A few matches took place, which ended with little to no suspense or surprises. With a few sentences and words advice, the instructor ended the class and called forth her cruiser. In 5 seconds, the sleek cruiser zoomed above the field. With a stomp, the instructor jumped right into the open hatch. It was no surprise, and the students seemed to have gotten used to such a sight. Virum, terrifying amount of energy burst out from the 2 thruster engines at each side of the sky cruiser, taking off with inconceivable speed, leaving a streak of tailing lights. David parted ways with Nihia as they finished the last lectures for the day. Entering his room, he immediately activated the incognito mode in his room while simultaneously activating the training mode. The incognito mode secures every piece of information strictly to the room. The Institute would be unable to gain access to any information about him during the period the mode is active. There would be no form of spying or peeking. The room was absolutely secure. The bright light display wallpaper instantly darkened by a few degrees, and then the lights turned red. The temperature in the room began to increase along with the gradual increase of his room size after paying the required gyno points. Clang, clang. A few mechanical sounds rang out, and then the room had finished its expansion. Various training tools had also formed as they were assembled by a few mechanical arms which had existed in the room. After the transformation was complete, David sat down to regulate his breathing. The temperature in this surrounding M had risen significantly and could be noticed by the multiple sheen of sweat dripping down his body. Raising his hands, he stood up, as stable as Mount Tai. With a humming sound, his muscles began to quiver as his blood circulated rapidly along his system. His body abruptly shook as he circulated scorching heat technique along his system. His training method requires the use of heat to increase the user's strength. The heat the body can generate itself is only so limited, which was the reason he had also chosen a combat technique that utilizes the body to produce heat. With the combat technique, he could utilize his body heat whenever he wished, and if his temperature dropped, he could just freely generate the heat himself by circulating scorching fury. In other words, he had found a kind of shortcut to practice his training manual a few times more than other spryers. As he activated scorching fury, the temperature of his body rose by a few degrees. As the sweat dripping down his body increased dramatically, he wasn't one to waste his time. His muscles shook, vibrating at a wired frequency. Small-sized veins popped out from his body, looking intimidating. He was like a savage and cruel beast as the aura within him seemed to change. Suddenly, his chest puffed out like a balloon as the blood in his veins flowed like a river, creating a swooshing sound and the sound of his heartbeat running like an engine. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He propelled his blood cycle to its limits, creating thunderous sound inside his head. Abruptly, he shivered as a bang echoed in his ears. His blood screeched for a quarter of a second before resuming its cycle. Blood gushed into his head as it turned several shades red. His muscles shook as the temperature of his body reduced by more than 50 degrees Celsius. It was terrifying. He felt a tinge of pain in his heart, but compared to the last time he executed his training manual, it was a little painful. His blood cycle limits had increased again as newfound strength filled his body. He still had many more repetitions to go. Executing any training methods was always uncomfortable and comes with bits of pains which varies accordingly to the techniques or the number of repetitions made by the individual, which was the price for gaining an increase in strength. Every training manual has its limited amount of times. It could be performed no matter how easy it may seem. And more importantly, if a training method is used continuously without advancing to the next level, the efficiency fades after a period of time, and the increase in strength after each repetition reduces after a certain period of time. For example, the formless heat training method that David was currently practicing has 3 levels to it. The first level allows David to practice the training method for at most 2 repetitions only, forcing a sharp spike or an increase in his heartbeat before his heart begins to fail due to the overusage of it. It was like forcing an engine used to moving a cart and then forcing the engine to move a train. It would fail. It was the same for the hearts, or his body losing too much heat, which would also cause his organs to fail. With the great control of strength he had over his body, he could easily practice the training method a few more times higher than it was stated. He could easily avoid wasting energy mindlessly, unlike other spryers would. The warning was meant for those who mindlessly practiced the manual with no reservation, as they could only roughly propel their blood and roughly oscillate their muscles. It eventually lead into wasting too much energy and then overworking the hearts, which would eventually lead to 1 to 2 repetitions before they would reach their limits. But David was different. With his ability, he could smoothly propel his blood and easily oscillate his muscles at the frequency that had been stated. Little to no energy would be wasted during that period compared to his peers, allowing him to execute the method a few times more than required without overdrafting his heart. Grunting in pain, blood rushed once more into his head due to the disruption of circulation. His face, which was already red, couldn't even redden any longer. His body went cold for a few seconds, but he hurriedly no time in circulating scorching fury and heat returned into his body. He had long since reached the perfection state of scorching fury, burning blood. The heat, which was supposed to be generated in his arms with the circulation of the technique, was now generated in every part of his body. His blood practically boiled with heat as steam could be seen raising from his red-colored head. The hairs in his body had curled in every which way. It was a wonder if it could even be straightened back. Due to the terrible pain he felt, he knew he had almost reached his limits, and he could perform another cycle of it before reaching his absolute limit, but David wasn't intending to do so. He preferred not to get close to that line, as it may affect his heart or cause some hidden injury, which might surface later on. It was the 5th time, and also the last time he was planning to do for the day. Gazing at the fitness tracker's holographic image, he smiled with what he saw. His CPM had increased to a terrifying 67 cycles per minute. His rate of improvement left him feeling satisfied, but soon, it was replaced by a serious look. He had something important he wished to do. David entered through the library. It was his first time in the library in this life, for the previous ones, ever since he had been admitted into the institute. The library was creepily quiet, but he could see lots of students walking to and fro from different directions, but he couldn't even hear a single sound of footsteps sounding out. But something caught his eyes. There was a transparent blue barrier that was enveloping the entire library with how huge it was. It wasn't very visible, but if one looked closely, one would be able to notice it. David's expression changed as he was suddenly reminded of the technology Lu Feng had used to block his imprint from sending out any forms of distress signal. F1. B4U cubic EMP. But this particular one was different. It didn't seem to stop the function of his imprint. It seems its only function was to counter any sounds made in the library. Although he didn't know the principle behind it, such technology, it was nothing short of amazing to him, which came down to the main reason he was here. He was here specifically for the gadgets the Institute had to offer. Last time he had suffered a loss because he couldn't find ways to counter the silencing series EMP. But now, he came to increase his knowledge and also maybe get a few contraptions on his way to his room. What did you say? That guy's finally out. Nick's eyes widened in surprise as he quickly asked his clansmate who he had assigned to keep an eye on David. It had been quite the while he was hoping to catch David unawares. But every time he was hoping he would catch David after the lectures are over, with every passing day, he always failed though, as David would always head directly to his classes and then to his dorm almost immediately. There was not enough time for him to travel a few miles to teach DAV a lesson, as David had probably gone to his dorm. This situation frustrated him, but now the opportunity had finally come when he had almost given up. Yes, he entered the library a few minutes ago. The youth nodded his head in confirmation. Huh, very good. Billy, he finally came out of his turtle shell. I will make sure to reward you well for bringing such good news. Nick laughed happily as he promised. He waved his hands, intending for Billy to leave the room. Then, he stood up from his seat as he turned towards a lanky youth who was by his side and whispered, Have you gotten that item from there yet? Glancing at door, Sebastian only spoke up once the door was closed. Boss, those people aren't easy to deal with at all, but thankfully, I didn't disappoint your faith in me. He then carefully opened up his backpack and then slowly took out a cubic glass object which seemed quite fragile. You didn't disappoint me as always. I'm sure you had quite the rough time. Giving you a few gyno points in return doesn't seem quite right. Nick carefully took over the cubic object with electric currents flowing inside. After gazing at it intently, he kept it safely as he continued. From now onwards, you will officially become my right-hand man as rise to power within the Institute. That is your reward, he said with an awe-inspiring time as he turned towards Sebastian. What do you think of my reward? Cursing in his mind, he was already the right-hand man. How was being officially assigned benefit him, but outside? His expression was happy as he replied, It's my honor. Let's go. And also, contact the rest. We need to make sure he doesn't SKO. Yes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. DAV frowned as he walked out of store. Gloom covered his face. He had never thought contraptions were very expensive. This was the 4th store he had gone to already, but The outrageous amount of gyno points scared him witless. He didn't even own enough gyno points to take care of himself yet. If he mindlessly spent it on some time-used gadget, the pain would hunt him for a long time. There was one that David had seen, and it was absolutely amazing. He had wanted to get it the instant he saw it, but when he saw the price, he almost choked on his own spit. It was even the lowest grade of the Skywalker series, but it costs 10,000 gyno points. Selling himself might not cost that much. Forget it. Although it's cool and nice to own gadgets or contraptions, it is more important to increase his own strength rather than relying on something else. David forced himself to believe that. It was almost midnight. David left the section and headed towards his dorm. One might think he'd been traumatized by the previous event, but David still took the same shortcut he had taken when he fought Lu Feng. He had only walked about a few meters when suddenly the sound of different footsteps seemed to rhyme with his footstep. Every step he took, the other footsteps seemed to synchronize with him. He ignored it and walked a few meters forward, but suddenly his heartbeat also seemed to beat in sync with the sound of their footstep, as a weird energy seemed to generate itself along with the beating of his footstep and heart. But before the energy could be fully formed, it was suddenly burned away by a scorching heat which David's body had generated itself. If it were an ordinary Spryher, they would be grievously injured if they weren't careful. But David didn't have to do anything. His scorching fury was at a high state. It wouldn't allow a different force to exist inside Dav's body aside from itself. It was law that two different energies unable to exist simultaneously without one devouring the other unless there was a catalyst, enlisting an equilibrium to energy. David wasn't stupid enough to believe that with the vibrations his body got through the feedback from the ground, he wasn't strong enough to produce such intense vibrations. He knew he had been sneak attacked,